Russia's airstrikes have devastated Ukraine for months, but thanks to Canada, that's about to end. Canada has just delivered a cutting-edge air defense system that could cripple Russia's missiles, drones, and glide bombs, leaving Putin's air force powerless. What is this game-changing weapon, and why did it take so long, and how will it transform Ukraine's defense? Let's dive into the details, starting with the big question: what exactly has Canada delivered to Ukraine? We learned the answer on November 21st when Canada's Defense Minister Bill Blair announced the delivery of $406 million worth of national or Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, or NASAMS, to Ukraine. That delivery had been a long time coming. Canada pledged these powerful aerial defense weapons to Ukraine all the way back in early 2023, with their delivery now being set to mark a turning point in the war. "I can't give you more information on that because of operational security," Blair told reporters when quizzed about the NASAMS delivery. "But we have been able to deliver at long last, and I think it's going to make a difference because it will enable them to protect communities." The delivery couldn't be timelier. Just days before Canada announced the arrival of NASAMS in Ukraine, Putin was proudly boasting that Russia had fired a new medium-range hypersonic missile at his enemy. That missile struck a Ukrainian military facility in Dnipro, where it injured 2 people. We say military facility, but it was anything but that, according to Ukraine, who said that Russia actually targeted an industrial facility being used as a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities. Facing such new weapons, especially missiles being targeted at more civilian infrastructure, means that Ukraine needs more aerial defenses. The NASAMS delivers. The Government of Canada website went into more detail about the delivery. It says the new NASAMS units will strengthen Ukraine's air defenses not only at military sites but also in population centers and key civilian infrastructure. The weapon system will also help Ukraine to make better use of the more than 300 air defense missiles Canada has delivered to Ukraine since Putin started his special military operation. Blair was also quick to thank Canada's other partners for finally making the delivery. "Canada's support for Ukraine is steadfast, and we will continue to step up and build on our contributions to Ukraine in their fight against Russia's invasion," said Blair. "We thank the United States, as well as our partners in Norway, for their collaboration and ensuring the safe arrival of Canada's donation of this NASAMS to the armed forces of Ukraine." Defense and Security Monitor says that the NASAMS donation is especially notable because Canada lacks any substantial air defense capability of its own. It used to operate the Army's Air Defense Anti-Tank System, or ADATS. The system was scrapped in 2012, and Canada has been working on a replacement for ADATS ever since. It's possible that this NASAMS donation will increase the country's momentum toward developing that new air defense program, says Defense and Security Monitor, because Russia's actions in Ukraine show how vital such systems can be. Even better for Ukraine, the arrival of its new NASAMS launcher came just weeks before Ukraine received the 6th IRIS-T air defense system committed to it by Germany. The takeaway is simple. Ukraine's air defenses against Russia just got a whole lot stronger thanks to Canada. But we come to an interesting question. If Canada committed the NASAMS launcher to Ukraine at the beginning of 2023, why did it take almost 2 years for the system to arrive? It all comes down to the unique way that Canada aimed to donate its NASAMS. Rather than purchase and deliver the system directly, Canada instead chose to piggyback on a much larger arms purchase being made by the United States. The goal was simple. The US was making this purchase so it could donate more weapons to Ukraine. Canada only needed to provide the $406 million needed for the NASAMS for the US to add to its own aid package. The system would be bought and sent, expediting the delivery process. Only that didn't happen. Part of that was due to Canada's own delays in transferring the funds. It committed to delivering the NASAMS in January 2023, but it didn't send the money the US would need to make the purchase on Canada's behalf for 4 months. Thus, the entire purchase process was delayed. The US couldn't negotiate a contract with Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace, the NASAMS manufacturer, until it had that money in hand. America also needed to gain congressional approval for its own aid package, further delaying the negotiations for the NASAMS until that approval was finally granted in May 2023. Okay, so that accounts for 5 months of delays. But it took around 18 more months for the NASAMS to arrive in Ukraine. Why? Canada has been tight-lipped on the problems that followed and hasn't disclosed any official information. Blair himself touched on the negotiations issue, telling the Edmonton Journal in March 2024 that the back and forth between the US and Kongsberg went on longer than anybody had imagined it would. "The Americans have to secure the funding in order to finalize the contracts," Blair commented when talking not only about the NASAMS purchase but several others that the US intended to make from Kongsberg. "We've tried to expedite that. Unfortunately, the Americans ran into some challenges in their own funding envelope." Reading between the lines, we see that Canada's decision to piggyback onto an American military aid donation did nothing to expedite the NASAMS delivery. Internal American politics and funding delays resulted in the NASAMS not being purchased, even though Canada had delivered the funding to the US around a year prior. The whole purchase was left in limbo for over a year. That created a whole whole world of problems, with Blair saying the lack of the expedited timeline Canada had hoped to create via its coalition with the US could instead lead to the NASAMS delay taking years to resolve. Thankfully, that's not what happened. There were also manufacturing bottlenecks to consider. The NASAMS Canada intended to buy for Ukraine wasn't even built yet, with Kongsberg delegating those duties to Raytheon Technologies. Not only did that create a secondary negotiation, delaying things further, but it meant that a bottleneck was inevitable, even if the funding had been secured early. The system would still need to be built from scratch. The result for Ukraine was what we've now seen. 2 years of delays for an air defense system that is desperately needed to defend itself against constant Russian bombardments. If NASAMS had arrived at some point in 2023, even toward the end of the year, Ukraine could have used it to protect cities in the Donetsk region or key infrastructure, as Putin made his 2024 eastern push. Instead, Ukraine dealt with a world of pain while it waited. But wait it did, and it finally has NASAMS in its hands, which brings us to another question. What can NASAMS deliver to Ukraine? Entering service in 1997, NASAMS is a ground-based air defense system developed as part of a team-up between Kongsberg and RTX Corporation. It's crewed by 2 people and is used to shoot down practically any incoming aerial weapon, including cruise missiles, helicopters, and crucially, unmanned aerial vehicles. It's even capable of taking out some fixed-wing aircraft, though its missiles aren't quite fast enough to tackle the latest fighter jets. When Norway conceived of this system, it intended to use NASAMS to replace its Nike Hercules systems to bolster the defense of its southern air bases. The idea was to create a layered defense. NASAMS would fire from the ground while F-16s would take to the skies to tackle incoming threats. The system initially used the Norwegian adapted Hawk, or NOAA, a program comprised of a pair of color CRT displays, some KS500F computers, and a KMC9000 control console to serve as its command and control system. However, the problem with NOAA was that it was only capable of tracking a single target per launch pad. That's fine for a single aerial threat. But when dealing with bombardments of cruise missiles, as well as the drones that came later, NOAA simply wasn't fit for purpose. Norway eventually replaced NOAA with the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile system, which brought inertial navigation systems into the mix and gave NASAMS the ability to hit multiple targets. Upgrades to the radar followed, with testing showcasing the system's effectiveness and leading to official production in 1997. There have since been multiple versions of NASAMS, each delivering its own tweaks. NASAMS 2 upgraded the system's ground radar, along with enabling the use of Link 16, the standardized communication system favored by the United States and NATO. NASAMS 3 came along in April 2019 with an improved Fire Distribution Center station, a new trio of flat-panel displays, and a tweaked Mark II canister launcher capable of firing AIM-9X Sidewinder Block II missiles and AMRAAM-ERs, in addition to the AIM-120 AMRAAMs the weapon could already fire. Canada hasn't specified which version of the NASAMS Ukraine is getting, but given that the system had to be built before delivery, it's safe to assume that NASAMS 3 has arrived in Kyiv. The standard specs for NASAMS show just how impressive this weapon can be. It's capable of providing air defense at medium and long range, with its maximum range extending to 111.8 miles, more than enough distance to take out an incoming threat before it has a chance to touch down. NASAMS also has both active and passive tracking modes. In other words, the system can keep its eyes on the skies even without its crew manning it. Each missile the system fires can reach speeds of up to Mach 2.7, making them more than fast enough to deal with drones and helicopters, as well as glide bombs and most of the Soviet-era missiles Russia has used to pelt Ukraine. Those missiles are propelled by a solid-fueled rocket motor, and each one can weigh up to 335 pounds. Typically, the AMRAAM and Sidewinder missiles the NASAMS fires are packed with the AIM-120C high-explosive blast fragmentation warhead. These warheads deliver a double whammy of pain to Russian targets. The blast creates a shockwave, disorienting and potentially damaging Russian drones and missiles in flight. That shockwave is followed by fragmentation of the missile, which sees dozens of metal fragments projected away from the explosion at extremely high speeds to shred through the target. The NASAMS launcher is also impressive. The system comes packed with a trio of multi-missile launchers, with each carrying up to 6 missiles that are secured inside protective canisters. That allows the launcher to fire up to 18 missiles at once before needing to reload, allowing it to encounter any incoming Russian aerial barrage with one of its own. And it gets better. The NASAMS is capable of hosting 4 of these launcher trios, bringing its total launches to 12, and the number of missiles it can fire simultaneously to 72, each missile streaming toward a different target. And it's fast. NASAMS can unleash this full 72-missile volley in just 12 seconds, which, when combined with the missiles each being capable of reaching Mach 2.7 and the NASAMS' massive range, means Ukraine can easily counter any incoming missile and drone barrage it detects. The launcher is also portable, allowing Ukraine to transport it around the country and conceal it when it's not in use, so it's leveraged where it's most needed. Norway's military typically uses Scania 113H 6x6 trucks to transport its NASAMS. However, the system is flexible enough to be transported by multiple types of trucks. Spain uses Iveco, and Finland moves its NASAMS with Sisu trucks, meaning Ukraine has options in this department. The launcher also has a built-in hydraulic system used to help load and offload from trucks and position it when it's on the ground. That mobility also aids in reducing risk for the NASAMS two-person crew. They can remotely control the system when it's in active mode from a distance of up to 15.5 miles. So if Russia somehow manages to target and destroy Ukraine's NASAMS, there will be the small solace of the crew likely being spared and remaining intact to operate any future NASAMS Ukraine receives. In short, NASAMS is an impressive weapon. That's likely why 13 countries are still actively buying it from Kongsberg, with 15 also happily investing in the command and control solution the NASAMS uses. Those countries include the United States. NASAMS were installed in Washington, D.C. to protect key governmental assets, where they've been active since 2005. So how does Ukraine intend to use its Canadian-delivered air defense system? In 2 words, drone defense. Drones have been a hallmark of the Ukraine war on both sides of the conflict. Ukraine has used them to great effect to launch attacks on Russia's oil refineries, limiting the flow of much-needed fuel to the front lines, and even to take out some of the Black Sea Fleet. But Russia hasn't been far behind, and it's ramping up its own use of drones to combat Ukraine's innovations in the conflict. We saw this on January 20th, when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed just how intensive Russia's drone usage had become. He revealed that in the week beginning January 15th, Russia had launched a series of mass aerial attacks against numerous targets in Kharkiv, Lviv, Khmelnytsky, and Ivano-Frankivsk. There was also a missile attack on Kyiv, which killed 3 and injured 3. All told, the week saw Russia launch 550 drones, around 60 missiles, and a staggering 660 of its aerial glide bombs. Ukraine managed to thwart some of the attacks. Zelensky says the country's military shot down 33 of the 60 missiles, along with 311 drones. A further 136 drones failed to reach their intended targets despite a lack of Ukrainian military intervention. These numbers show the true scale of the aerial attacks Ukraine faces, with Zelensky making the country's position very clear. I am grateful to all our soldiers, military aviation, anti-aircraft gunners, electronic warfare units and mobile fire groups, said Ukraine's president. But the task remains unchanged. Continue strengthening our skies protection. Zelensky also called for the delivery of more Patriot air defenses. Just a couple of weeks earlier, Ukraine's Navy also revealed how vital those air defenses are. It says it managed to shoot down 37,000 drones during 2024, a stunning figure that amounts to around 101 drones per day. And that's just Ukraine's Navy. Add aerial and ground forces to that mix, and we may be able to double or even triple those numbers. Russia has also committed to manufacturing more than 32,000 drones per year by 2030, along with purchasing massive quantities from supporters like Iran to continue its UAV assaults. The NASAMS won't be a perfect solution to this massive drone problem, but it's definitely a start. The weapon's ability to fire up to 72 missiles at once will allow it to decimate the majority of a Russian drone assault on a city or key pieces of infrastructure. Of course, Ukraine can also use the weapon to target incoming missiles, meaning it gains versatility on the ground when it comes to dealing with Russia's ever-looming aerial threats. But Ukraine needs more air defenses. In September 2024, Zelensky met with former US Secretary of Defense Jake Lloyd during a gathering of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at Ramstein base. Zelensky thanked the US for its then recent $250 million aid package, before adding that Russia's increasing use of missiles and drone assaults meant that Ukraine was in dire need of additional air defense systems. Zelensky repeated these claims in December 2024 during an online address to the Joint Expeditionary Force Summit. We need the full implementation of the agreements on air defense deliveries, particularly those made at the NATO summit in Washington, he told the summit's participants. We remember that to compensate for the inability to invite Ukraine to join the NATO alliance at that stage, a significant number of air defense systems were promised to us. I ask for your help to deliver on this. How many more air defense systems does Ukraine need? Between 12 and 15 if the country is to fully protect itself from Russia's aerial bombardments. Canada's delayed delivery of the NASAMS takes Ukraine a little closer to total defense, but as Zelensky points out, more needs to be done to protect the Ukrainian skies and, by extension, minimize Russia's attacks on its energy, military, and civilian infrastructure. As for Canada, the NASAMS delivery allows it to cement its place as one of the most important contributors to Ukraine's defense. Its contributions certainly haven't won't stop at hardware like the NASAMS. As we speak, there are 350 Canadian Armed Forces personnel stationed in Ukraine, contributing to the training of Ukraine's soldiers. Those personnel have helped Ukraine improve the abilities of 43,000 troops who are sent into the field. Canada also worked as part of the training coalition designed to help Ukraine's fighter pilots get up to speed on the workings of the F-16s it's received, and is still in the process of receiving from its Western allies. Add all of this to the $4.5 billion in military assistance Canada has committed to Ukraine since the beginning of 2022, funding that will support military aid deliveries through 2029, and Zelensky has a clear partner that not only contributes directly, but is working hard behind the scenes to make Ukraine's military even stronger. As if to solidify that relationship, Canada was also one of the first countries to give Ukraine the go-ahead to use many of the weapons it had delivered as it wanted during Ukraine's invasion of Russia's Kursk Oblast back in August 2024. Ukrainians know best how to defend their homeland, and we're committed to supporting their capacity, said Canadian Defense Department spokesperson André-Anne Poulin at the time. Nothing has changed. In fact, Canada seems to be getting even more involved in the Ukraine war. Beyond finally delivering the much-needed NASAMS to Ukraine, Canada is also trying to help Ukraine win the drone war with Russia. We see this in its deliveries of drones to Ukraine, including 800 Skyranger R-70 multi-mission UAVs, valued at $95 million, that it sent to Kyiv in February 2024. Canada also expressed an interest in joining the drone coalition created by Latvia to support Ukraine, and other countries threatened by Putin's ambition, to help Latvia come closer to becoming a key drone supplier to Ukraine. Make no mistake about it, Canada's support is worth its weight in gold to Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky. The NASAMS is just one of many examples of Canada supporting Ukraine directly and behind the scenes. We can only wait to see what's next for this budding military alliance and what it will mean for Putin as he continues to try and complete his special military operation through massive aerial assaults. But what do you think about the delivery of the NASAMS to Ukraine? Has Canada given Zelensky and his military a game-changing weapon that nullifies Russia's aerial strategy? Will we see more NASAMS arrive in Ukraine in the future? Canada just dealt Russia a devastating blow, and it's done it by using a tactic that Russia itself has used to batter Ukraine since Putin began his special military operation. It's reviving Cold War-era weapons. These weapons will be a huge boon for Ukraine's air force, along with potentially offering ground-based utility, meaning Ukraine gets a versatile means of devastating Russian tanks and artillery. It gets worse for Putin. Canada isn't just sending a handful of these powerful weapons to Ukraine. It's sending a staggering 80,000, with each having the potential to decimate tanks, enemy artillery, and even penetrate deep into the heart of Russian ammunition storage facilities. Make no mistake, this is terrible news for Putin. So what are these Cold War-era weapons that Canada is about to send to Ukraine? Where do they come from, and how can Ukraine use them to not only boost its aerial might, but also its ground forces and even its drones? We'll answer all of those questions in this video, starting with the news of the delivery. In early September 2024, Canada's Defense Minister Bill Blair took part in a meeting of military minds at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. This meeting was one of 8 that have taken place at the base since the beginning of the Ukraine war, with each bringing together Ukraine's Western partners to discuss strategy and defense issues. It was there that Blair made his announcement. Canada had committed to shipping 80,840 CRV-7 rocket motors along with 1,300 warheads for those rockets to Ukraine. The shipment would arrive in Poland toward the end of 2024 and into the beginning of 25, before being moved on to Ukraine for its military to use against Russia. A generous gift for sure, but it's one that may have raised eyebrows among those who know the weapon. The CRV-7 is a powerful rocket system used by the Canadian Air Force in its CF-18 fighter jets for several decades. However, the weapon was eventually decommissioned, with Canada having previously planned to spend millions of dollars to dismantle the rockets and potentially use their parts in other weapons. Putin's vicious campaign in Ukraine put the brakes on that plan, with Canada instead realizing that Ukraine might be able to find a use for the thousands of CRV-7s it had in its stockpiles. Rather than spend money to fully decommission these weapons, why not send them to Ukraine, where they can be refurbished or stripped for parts that Ukraine could use in other weapon systems? The idea was first floated by the leader of Canada's Conservative Party, Pierre-Marcel Poilievre. He pointed out that spending millions of Canadian dollars to decommission the rockets was a waste when they could find use elsewhere. During a debate in Canada's House of Commons, he argued that it was time to update the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine to open the door for sending over 80,000 CRV-7s. Instead of making Canadians pay millions of dollars to decommission these weapons, he said, the weapons could be given to Ukraine, who can use them in the defense of sovereignty. it appears Canada's ruling Liberal Party agreed. In the wake of Poilievre's comments, Canada sent a handful of these rocket engines to Ukraine before Blair made his full announcement. In June 2024, it confirmed that it had sent 2,000 to Putin's opponent, perhaps as part of a test run to see if Ukraine could actually make use of such an old rocket. Clearly it could, as the announcement of another 80,000 plus was made just a few short months later. The rockets are the latest in a consistent stream of military aid Canada has sent to Ukraine, with the total committed by the Great White North being about $3.3 billion at the time it confirmed the transfer. But what's the big deal, you may be thinking at this point? These are rockets that were in the process of being decommissioned. What possible use could they have in Ukraine? It's a good question, especially as it seems, on the surface at least, that Canada is just looking to get rid of an expensive problem by sending 80,000 CRV-7s to Ukraine. But the reality is much different. These rockets may be old, but they're still extremely useful in the war of attrition that Putin has forced onto Ukraine. How? We start with what the rockets themselves do. Short for Canadian Rocket Vehicle 7, the CRV-7 was introduced in the 1970s to serve as an upgrade to the 2.75-inch air-to-ground rockets the United States was using at the time. Produced by Bristol Aerospace in Manitoba, the CRV-7 was also a 2.75-inch rocket system, though it made massive upgrades on what was available at the time. Power was one of those upgrades. Bristol designed the rocket so it was capable of penetrating standard Warsaw-packed aircraft hangars, which were in heavy use by the Soviet Union at the time. If that seems unimportant, remember that Russia has relied heavily on its Soviet-era weaponry and storage facilities throughout the Ukraine war. Having a weapon that can penetrate hangars that are still in use by Russia is a massive boon for Ukraine. To this day, the CRV-7 is one of the most powerful air-to-ground rockets available. Even though Canada planned to decommission 80,000 of them before changing tack and sending them to Ukraine, several other countries still have active versions of these weapons in their arsenals. The rocket is being sold to 13 other nations, with the system comprised of the rocket motors, of which Ukraine will receive 80,000, along with launchers and warheads. Cheap along with being powerful, the CRV-7 is also extremely reliable, achieving a successful launch rate of 99%, according to Magellan Aerospace Corporation. So where did the rocket come from? It began life as an offshoot of research conducted at the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, or CARDI, now named DRDC Valcartier, in the 1950s. Initially, CARDI was researching how to create powerful rockets that used solid fuels as part of a general research project focused on the development of anti-ballistic missiles. CARDI began working with Bristol, with the two organizations eventually producing the Black Brant sounding rocket in the 1960s. The rocket served its purpose for about a decade. It also laid the groundwork for what would become the CRV-7. By the 1970s, CARDI and Bristol had come up with the idea of tweaking the Black Brant design by using the same engine and solid fuel to create a 2.7-inch variant that could be mounted into the Canadian CF-104. By 1973, that rocket was ready for production, weighing 14.5 pounds when empty and rising to 24.5 pounds when equipped with a warhead. The new CRV-7 had a burn time of just 2.2 seconds and was a revelation in unguided air-to-surface missiles in the 1970s. Why? We only need to compare it to the Mark 40 Mighty Mouse rockets the United States was using at the time. The CRV-7 used a higher fuel energy, lending the rocket much greater power, and had a redesigned fuselage that gave the rocket a flatter trajectory once launched. Impact was also a major plus point. The CRV-7 hit twice as hard as the Mighty Mouse once it reached its target, with that increase in power giving it the ability to penetrate the Soviet-era hangars we mentioned earlier. Add to all of that an effective range of just over 13,100 feet, and the West suddenly had an air-to-surface rocket that could be launched from higher ranges than ever before while delivering a devastating payload. There was only one problem: the C-14 engine built for the rocket. The aluminium-based fuel the engine used generated massive amounts of smoke upon firing the CRV-7. That was fine for the fighter jets for which the rocket was initially designed. However, it also limited the CRV-7's usability. Helicopters and slow-moving aircraft couldn't use the rocket because they would get caught up in the smoke it generated, limiting visibility and making them sitting ducks for aerial defenses following a CRV-7 launch. Bristol and CARDI solved this problem by producing a new engine, the C-15, that didn't use aluminium and featured a tail-mounted igniter that the CRV-7 ejected upon being fired. There was now less smoke, but that igniter had a habit of hitting the aircraft that launched the rocket, leading to the development of the head-end permanent igniter that was no longer ejected. Further tweaks led to the development of the C-17 and C-18 engines, making the CRV-7 suitable for helicopter use. That generated practically no smoke at all. Then there were the warheads. The CRV-7 can be equipped with one of 5 powerful warheads, each serving a unique purpose. The WTU-5001 weighs 10 pounds and is typically used as a training substitute. However, it features an 8-pound flat-ended soft steel rod encased in a nylon fairing, which makes it useful as a penetrating weapon when faced with armor. Next up is the general-purpose flechette. Each of these warheads contains 80 tungsten flechettes, which are essentially darts designed to shred through people that weigh 18 grams each. As well as being effective in the anti-personnel sense, these flechettes can pierce through the rolled homogeneous armor many military vehicles use to a depth of 1.5 inches. Each flechette flies individually rather than tumbling, ensuring greater accuracy when used against vehicles or infantry units. On the incendiary front, the CRV-7 can be loaded with the RA-79 Mod A1 high-explosive incendiary semi-armor-piercing warhead. This warhead is intended for use against ships, potentially making it very helpful against the remnant of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and uses the kinetic energy the CRV-7 generates to penetrate ship hulls. A delay fuse packed into the warhead causes it to ignite after it's penetrated, maximizing the damage it causes to ships by ensuring its explosive power isn't wasted on the ship's hull. That penetrative quality also makes it effective against other armored targets, such as tanks. Coming back to the anti-personnel front, the CRV-7 can also be equipped with the M151 high-explosive point-detonating warhead. Weighing 8.7 pounds without its fuse, this warhead also contains 2.3 pounds of composition B4 explosive. Said explosive detonates upon impact with a target, splitting the warhead into thousands of fragments that can cause severe shrapnel damage against infantry. Finally, there are the M257 and M278 illumination warheads. As the name implies, this warhead explodes to illuminate about a square mile of the battlefield, generating light equivalent to 1 million candles for 120 seconds. That makes it perfect for low-light operations, where Ukraine needs to see the precise positions Russian units have taken. It's these warheads that lend the CRV-7 the extreme versatility that has led to them being used as the unguided munition of choice for over a dozen Western nations, along with Canada and the United States, throughout much of the Cold War era. It's also that versatility that leads us to our next question. Exactly how is Ukraine going to use the massive stock of 80,000 CRV-7 rockets it's due to receive from Canada? Adaptability will play a huge role in the CRV-7's utility against Russia. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it won't have a huge supply of the warheads we've just discussed, as it'll receive around 1,300 of them compared to over 80,000 rockets, so it'll need to arm the majority of the CRV-7s itself, which it can do with almost any warhead weighing in the 10-pound region that it has in its stockpiles. Further adaptability comes from the fact that Ukraine is likely to be able to use the CRV-7 as more than an air-to-surface rocket. As Bulgarian military points out, the CRV-7 can be altered for use in multiple contexts. It's just as likely that Ukraine will fit the rockets into ground-based launcher systems. That's on top of Ukraine likely being able to use the rockets with its Soviet-era helicopters, like the Mi-8 and the Mi-24s, so they can fight against tanks and artillery systems on the ground. In other words, the CRV-7 gives Ukraine options. It now has rockets, albeit unguided ones, that have tremendous penetrative power, can be packed with numerous warheads, and are small enough to be launched from several aerial and ground-based platforms. That's terrifying for Russia, because it opens up the possibility that Ukraine could launch the kinds of all-encompassing rocket bombardments against its positions that Russia has used so frequently to target Ukraine's defenses. There's another reason why Canada has sent so few warheads compared to CRV-7 rocket engines. Some of Canada's existing warheads have degraded to the point where they're unusable. Though the solid propellant in these warheads can last for decades, it needs the appropriate storage conditions to do so. It appears that Canada can't guarantee that all of its warheads meet those criteria, meaning its choice to only send 1,300 warheads is less an example of it being stingy with its weapons and more of a choice made out of concern for Ukraine. Canada wants to deliver reliable weapons. It knows that most of its CRV-7 engines will either work or be usable in other ways. As for Ukraine, it has plenty of options when it comes to rearming these weapons. The country has made great strides to increase its domestic defense production industry. We see this most clearly in how it increased its production of mortar and artillery ammunition from 1 million rounds in 2023 to 2.5 million rounds in 2024, a 150% increase. And it's not just mortar and artillery that's seeing such dramatic increases. Ukraine saw its total domestic arms production, primarily led by drone manufacturing, grow by 500% during 2024. It also shows no signs of slowing down. Buoyed by the Danish model, which has seen Denmark provide Ukraine with hundreds of millions of dollars to build its own weapons rather than sending weapons directly, Ukraine's arms industry will likely grow further in 2025. That growth will be massive for its ability to use the CRV-7. With more infrastructure comes the ability for Ukraine to build its own warheads. It doesn't need any of the older and potentially less reliable warheads Canada has in its stockpiles. Ukraine will likely spend some time reverse engineering the CRV-7, with Canada's help, to figure out how to build its own variants of the warheads we've already discussed. It may also be able to rely on other European countries, perhaps Poland and Romania, to build even more warheads outside of Ukraine. There's just one more problem for Ukraine to overcome. The CRV-7 is dumb. No, we don't mean that it's a stupid weapon, rather the CRV-7 is an unguided rocket, which affects how Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. The rocket needs to be aimed. For instance, Ukraine is likely going to load at least some of its CRV-7s into its Soviet-era attack helicopters. These helicopters won't be able to fire and forget these missiles while relying on internal guidance systems to ensure they reach their targets. The choppers will have to get up close and personal. That means flying within viewable range of a target before pointing their noses at said target to ensure the CRV-7s fire in their direction. Once in the air, the rockets have extremely stable trajectories that make it very likely they'll hit home as long as they're aimed properly. However, it does mean that Ukraine's chopper pilots may need to scale a steep learning curve to use the CRV-7s, something that should be doable given the sheer volume of these rockets that Canada has sent. The rockets being unguided also creates more risk for Ukraine when it tries to use them, which brings us to another question. Is there any way for Ukraine to get around the dumb rocket challenge? Possibly. In 2006, Bristol started working on a new version of the CRV-7 called the CRV-7 PG. The PG stands for Precision Guided, and the company's work transformed the standard CR-7 into a smart munition, capable of hitting a target without being aimed. It was loaded with a seeker created by Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace, which was installed in the front of an otherwise unchanged CRV-7. That seeker uses an inertial guidance system that activates during the mid-course of the rocket's journey and allows it to home in on a target using a laser designator. In other words, the target is marked with a laser and the CRV-7 PG can hit it without a pilot or ground crew needing to aim the rocket. The PG version of the CRV-7 was put on sale in 2007, with Bristol having since developed versions that use GPS tracking and offer anti-radiation seeking capabilities. It's unknown how many, if any, of the 80,000 CRV-7s Ukraine has received from Canada are the PG versions, but it may not matter. The modifications needed to transform a CRV-7 into its PG variant are fairly minor and can be done using a kit that includes the in-flight control system and new tail fins. If Ukraine is able to secure some of these kits, or build some of its own with Canada's help, it'll make its CRV-7s even more useful, especially as anti-tank weapons. Combining the PG kit with a suitable penetrative warhead would make Ukraine's new stock of CRV-7s usable as long-range anti-tank weapons that pack a harder punch and move even faster than traditional air-to-tank weapons like the AGM-114 Hellfire. Add to that the tube-mounted variant of the CRV-7, which Bristol developed for Canadian Special Forces and could also be used in Ukraine to attack tanks from the ground, and you'll see why Putin is so terrified of this weapon. Remember that Russia has already lost 9,833 tanks and almost 20,500 armored fighting vehicles in Ukraine. Both could become targets of Ukraine's adapted CRV-7 rockets. And given that Russia was believed to only have about 7,000 more tanks in storage in September 2023, you can see the numbers game starting to play out in Ukraine's favor. Having 80,000 rockets capable of destroying tanks means that the 7,000 Russia has yet to deploy don't stand much of a chance. With the CRV-7, Ukraine has an opportunity to destroy thousands more Russian mechanized units, forcing Putin to increasingly rely on human wave assaults that cost him even more in manpower. And it gets worse. For Putin, Russia's leader might feel that some of the impact of this massive delivery of 80,000 CRV-7s will be mitigated by at least some of the rockets not working anymore. After all, many of them were built during the Cold War era. And if there's one thing Putin has discovered himself during his special military operation, it's that you can't expect all Cold War weapons to work as they did decades ago. He might be right. But any non-working CRV-7s will only create even more problems for Russia. Ukraine's massive investment into drone manufacturing means that it'll be able to strip any non-working CRV-7s down for parts to build even more of its unmanned aerial vehicles. Those drones now account for 80% of Russia's frontline personnel losses. So if Ukraine can't target tanks, artillery, and other armored weapons on the ground with CRV-7s, it can indirectly target personnel by repurposing these powerful rockets for use as part of its ever-growing drone army. And just to rub salt into the wounds, the CRV-7s aren't the only weapons Canada committed to Ukraine toward the end of 2024. It's also going to send over 970 C-6 machine guns, each one being mountable on armored and off-road vehicles, along with 10,500 9mm pistols Ukraine can use to ensure its infantry has access to more small arms for ground battles. Add to this the decommissioned chassis of 29 M113 armored personnel carriers and 64 Coyote light armored vehicles, all of which Ukraine can repurpose for its own vehicles, and you have a bumper aid package of which the 80,000 CRV-7s are simply the biggest part. More Canadian help is coming in the future too, with Blair announcing a further $440 million in military aid in 2025. That money will primarily go to helping Ukraine procure larger caliber ammunition and funding its Danish model so it can build more of its own drones and munitions. Canada is intent on making Ukraine's air force, along with its ground forces, unstoppable. The delivery of over 80,000 CRV-7s helps it along its way, leaving Putin shaking in his boots at the prospect of a Ukraine that can take out more of his mechanized units than ever before. But what do you think about this bumper rocket delivery from Canada to Ukraine? Will it be a game changer in the Ukraine war? How do you think Ukraine will use its new stockpiles of CRV-7s? Think you know who poses the biggest threat to Russia? Think again. While the US is often seen as the primary challenger to Vladimir Putin's power, there's another country that should have him quaking in his boots, and it's not who you might expect. Sure, we often focus on the geopolitical giants like the US, Russia, and China, but zoom in on Russia and you'll find a surprising contender emerging from the shadows. It's not America, but America's northern neighbor, Canada, that presents a formidable challenge to Moscow. Yep, you heard that right. Canada has far more influence on Russia's future than many, including Putin, may realize. In this video, we'll dive into the reasons why Canada is such a major thorn in Moscow's side and why it represents a significant threat. And it all comes down to one battleground: the Arctic Ocean. In April 2021, Russia filed a submission to the United Nations, or UN, with a single goal in mind: claim more of the Arctic Ocean and its seabed. Within the claim lay plans to extend Russia's territorial claims over Arctic waters right to the borders of Canada's exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. Under maritime law, an EEZ is an area of an ocean over which a nation can stake a territorial claim up to 200 nautical miles offshore from one of its coasts. Within that EEZ, the nation can both exploit the natural resources it finds to its own benefit by virtue of having a territorial claim over them and control the shipping that passes through the territory. Speaking to CBC, University of Durham professor Philip Steinberg says that Russia's submission to the UN would see it expand its own territorial waters by over 270,000 square miles, while granting it control of waters that are essentially right on Canada's back door. Naturally, Canada opposed the submission, not least because it had made a submission of its own that overlapped with a territory that Russia was attempting to claim. University of Calgary political science professor Robert Hubert noted that Russia's claim overlapped with Canada's in the North Pole region, but went far beyond that. Here's a situation where they're, meaning Russia, claiming the entire Canadian and Danish continental shelf as part of their continental shelf. Other commentators at the time took a more relaxed approach. Those included Whitney Lackenbauer, a professor at Trent University, who pointed out that Russia had gone through the appropriate legal challenges to make its claim. She also believes that Russia didn't seriously believe that it would gain much territory for which it made its submission. Instead, it was looking to bring Canada, Denmark, and other countries that lay claim to the Arctic's continental shelf to the table. Setting out to negotiate where the outermost limits would be was something that was always on the cards, she said. In other words, Russia was merely trying to accelerate a discussion that should already have been happening. Nevertheless, the claim was seen as a challenge to Canada's sovereign rights in the Arctic. Toward the end of 2023, the issue still hadn't been resolved, with Russia again emphasizing that it needed to exert its influence within the Arctic. The country's Navy chief, Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, made this clear when he said, "There is a need for full-scale expansion into the continental shelf beyond the borders of the 200-mile exclusive economic zone." In other words, Russia needs to have more control over the Arctic. That would extend to 70% of the ocean, according to Maritime Executive, though negotiations would stall given that Russia was deep into its special military operation in Ukraine by the time Yevmenov made his statement. The questions are now simple. Why does any of this matter, and what does it have to do with Canada having an impact on Russia? We'll start with why it matters. Part of the issue comes down to gas and oil ownership. According to Just Energy, the Arctic is believed to be home to at least 90 billion barrels of oil, along with 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Add 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquid into the mix and you have extremely rich territory. The oil alone offers billions of dollars in potential revenue. At the time of creating this video, a barrel of crude oil sold for $82.71, meaning 90 billion barrels would equate to revenue of more than $7.4 trillion. Even more importantly, these oil and gas deposits are only what's been discovered thus far. As Just Energy notes, much of the Arctic region remains unexplored, both due to territorial disputes and the many challenges that come with exploring such an inhospitable region, meaning there may be more oil and gas available. Oil and gas are important for Russia. Its energy sector accounts for 20% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on average per year, with that number fluctuating based on prices. If Russia can control more oil and gas, it can also control supply and thus strengthen its geopolitical and economic influence. Russia's claims over the Arctic are intended to create that influence, with Canada being one of the key countries standing in its way. It also shouldn't escape mention that Canada is making its own claims over the Arctic seabed. The oil and gas Russia seeks could end up in Canadian hands if Canada is successful, representing a threat to Russia's slice of the energy markets. So Russia has a twofold goal: to get more oil and gas while keeping those resources out of the hands of other countries that have stakes in the Arctic, such as Canada and the United States, in the process. There are other economic factors at play for Russia. According to the Carnegie Endowment, about a third of all the fish harvested in Russia comes from the Arctic, turning the waters into one of the country's key food sources. Russia will naturally benefit from the warming of the Arctic waters, more on that later, by 2030, which it believes will push fish stocks northward and into its existing EEZs. Still, having control over more of the Arctic would mean more freedom for its fishing industry. The Arctic could transform into Russia's primary source of food, with the fish it catches also being exportable to offer a boost to its economy. It's also worth noting that Russia already has extensive control over Arctic waters. The Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum that promotes cooperation between the 8 nations that have coastlines letting out into the Arctic Ocean. Both Russia and Canada are key members of that council. According to the Arctic Council, Russia accounts for 53% of the Arctic's ocean coastline, with the country having 2.5 million people living in what it considers Arctic territory. Russia also believes that its history in the Arctic should entitle it to a great share of the ocean's waters. As the Carnegie Endowment points out, Russia has maintained a presence in the ocean for several centuries. In fact, it was the discovery of oil and gas in Siberia, which sits both below and above the Arctic Circle, that played a huge role in Russia's economic expansion in the post-Soviet era. Those discoveries underwrote the country's domestic economic stability. Therefore, gaining access to the billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of gas confirmed to be on the Arctic Ocean's shelf would ensure greater economic stability for Russia, which it believes is backed by historical claims. What does all of this mean so far? Russia and Canada find themselves in a battle for supremacy over the Arctic waters that lie outside of their EEZs. Both have submitted claims to the UN for sovereignty over waters outside of these, though Russia's 2021 claim is the most egregious, given that it would essentially give Moscow control over the entire Arctic beyond other countries' EEZs. Russia's actions in Ukraine have also stalled negotiations related to these territorial disputes. Control over these waters would be invaluable to both Russia and Canada economically because of the oil and gas deposits in the Arctic, both discovered and undiscovered. Plus, that control would strengthen both countries' fishing industries, with Russia in particular having the potential to turn the Arctic Ocean into its primary food source. Each of these issues highlights why Canada could become such a threat to Russia. If it's able to expand its territorial claims over the Arctic at the expense of Moscow, it gets access to oil and fishing that Russia desires. This wouldn't be enough to collapse Russia's economy. It would still be an oil and gas-rich nation, with much of these resources coming from EEZs it already has in place in the Arctic. But Russia would lose a chance at improving both its economic and food stability, the latter being an important issue given that 400,000 Russians were identified as severely food insecure on average between 2019 and 21. However, these issues, though important, don't represent the largest threat that Canada poses to Russia in the Arctic. That can be summed up in 3 words: the Northwest Passage. To the world's early explorers, the Northwest Passage was more of a myth than a realistic possibility. However, that didn't stop centuries of expeditions designed to find a safe route through the Arctic waters, due in large part to the trading benefits such a route would provide. Discovering the Arctic, a UK-based research group, offers a general timeline of the search for a true Northwest Passage. It says that the Inuit are largely considered to be the first group of people that explored the Arctic, with those explorations leading them to discovering a Northwest Passage they could use for trading. However, the passage was constricted during this period, with the Inuit unable to see beyond local trading routes because they had yet to discover the wider world outside of their territory. The real search began in the 16th century. By this point, European and Asian countries were trading regularly and had well-established seaborne routes to one another. The problem was that these routes required crews to spend months at sea, with a ship sailing from Europe to Asia having to navigate around southern Africa to reach its destination. A shorter route was required, which led to explorers turning their attention to the northern waterways. Martin Frobisher was one of the first to attempt to establish a Northwest Passage. In 1576, he took a small fleet into the northern waters, intent on finding a safe route through them. He failed. 2 years at sea led him to an inlet that now bears his name, but he could go no further. Others followed in his wake, though all similar attempts failed. That is until 1845, when Queen Victoria of England gave the order for Sir John Franklin to finally establish a safe Northwest Passage. Franklin was well equipped. He had a crew of 134 sailors and 3 years of supplies to supplement the voyage. The family members of the sailors were so confident in his upcoming success, they even sent letters to China. Those letters would never reach the sailors. By 1848, it was clear that Franklin's men hadn't made it through the Northwest Passage. Rescue ships were sent out multiple times over the decade that followed, with more than 2,000 men and 40 ships searching for Franklin's ships. Finally, 1859 brought with it the discovery of corpses on King William Island, as well as documentation that indicated that Franklin's ships had become frozen in the ice, his men dying as they desperately searched for land on which to alight. Still, Franklin had discovered several links in the Northwest Passage, with the later rescue attempts discovering even more. Mapping of the region was within the world's grasp, though it would be almost 50 years until another explorer finally succeeded. That man was Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian who sailed the entire Northwest Passage in a simple 21-foot fishing boat named the Gjoa. On the way, he encountered several Inuit tribes, whose knowledge of the Arctic waters proved invaluable in helping him to map out the various links through the passage. He also encountered ice, being forced to wait for months on end at various points before his ship could pass through on its voyage to the South Pole. Amundsen had essentially created a proof of concept. Sailing through the Northwest Passage was possible, though it came at great cost. Having to wait for the ice to melt meant that the route still wasn't usable for trade, as the months wasted on waiting made the more traditional routes more viable. The Northwest Passage remained a legend, but that's looking as if it might change. As discovering the Arctic notes, finding a secure route through the Northwest Passage today would make maritime voyages almost 4,350 miles shorter than they currently are. Right now, ships sailing from the Americas or Europe into Asia typically pass through the Panama Canal, with the establishment of a reliable route saving around 2 weeks on a typical voyage. The organization uses a voyage between London and Tokyo as an example. Today, completing that voyage using the Panama Canal requires a ship to sail almost 14,300 miles. Even using the Suez Canal only slashes around 1,250 miles from the journey. If a Northwest Passage existed, shipping companies could save time and money, with the passage likely transforming into one of the most important in global maritime trade. However, the same problem that stopped so many early explorers in their tracks still exists: ice. Only the most heavily reinforced icebreakers are currently able to make their way reliably through the Northwest Passage due to it being frozen over for most of the year. So we come back to a question: what does any of this have to do with Russia and Canada? Earth.org provides the answer. In a September 2021 article, created around the same time that Russia made its submission to the UN, it revealed that the frozen waters of the Northwest Passage aren't likely to stay frozen for much longer. It says that global warming has caused the Arctic to warm at a rate that's twice that of any other region in the world, with that warming leading to extensive ice loss. The volume of ice in the Arctic has already fallen by 75% since the 1980s, the resource claims, with 2050 potentially bringing with it the first ice-free summers the Northwest Passage has ever experienced if the current rate of global warming goes on unabated. Those transformations in the Arctic are huge for Russia, Canada, and any other nation that lays claims to the Arctic waters. With the disappearance of ice comes the possibility of establishing a Northwest Passage that can be navigated without ice-breaking vessels. The melting also promises greater access to the natural resources buried within the Arctic's continental shelf, including oil, gas, and metals that could include iron, copper, nickel, zinc, and phosphates. New shipping routes could be created, and with them, greater control over maritime trade for any nation that owns these routes. There will also be military possibilities. A country that controls the Northwest Passage could not only fill the waters with its own ships, but bar those ships from traveling from conflicting countries. Russia has already shown a defined interest in establishing northern maritime trade routes. In September 2023, Reuters reported on Russia's work with India and China in its efforts to create more ice-breaking vessels that would allow it to boost trade via the Northern Sea Route. Though not the same and not as expansive, the North Sea Route runs into many of the same problems in terms of ice blocking the shipping route. The route, which runs from the Russian port of Murmansk eastward toward the Bering Strait in Alaska, has long been seen as an alternative to using the Suez Canal by Russia. It's also seeing an increasing amount of trade pass through. Russia used this North Sea route to transport 34 million tons of cargo in 2022. It hopes to more than double that to 80 million by the end of 2024, with the projected number rising again to 200 million tons by 2031. Russia believes it needs 50 more icebreaker vessels to hit the 200 million ton target. The melting of the Arctic ice may make that moot. The point here is that Russia views the northern Arctic waters as a vital trading route of which it wants to take advantage. The same applies to Canada, and it's recognized the potential these waters hold for over a decade. In October 2013, Gerard Kenny published an article in the Canadian Encyclopedia in which he noted that ice is the only thing that prevents reliable east-west shipping through the Northwest Passage, and that this ice will become less of a problem as Arctic glaciers and snowfields disappear. At that point, he says the commercial value of newly opened shipping lanes through the Arctic will be huge, with the Prince of Wales Strait and the McClure Strait playing key roles in those new routes. Both are also considered Canadian territory. The Prince of Wales Strait lies within Canada's Northwest Territories, separating Victoria Island from Banks Island. It's a possible route for the mythical Northwest Passage because the Parry Channel, which is a 600-mile stretch of water, runs west from Baffin Bay to the strait. Historically, the Prince of Wales Strait has been considered unnavigable due to the amount of ice within it, though that soon may no longer be a problem, as established previously. Similarly, the McClure Strait is a Canadian territory that forms the northwestern end of the previously mentioned Parry Channel. It extends east into Baffin Bay and has similarly been named as a potential route within the Northwest Passage. Again, ice is a problem, so much so that 1969 saw the SS Manhattan, a US tanker, get stuck in the strait's ice, forcing a rescue by a Canadian icebreaker before it could complete its passage. In 2013, Kenny believed that Canada would soon face claims against its sovereignty in relation to these two straits, with those claims coming as a direct result of other countries hoping to take advantage of an emerging Northwest Passage. All of which brings us to Russia and its 2021 submission. Russia doesn't appear to have attempted to make a claim on any of these straits, and Canada reserves the right to regulate any activity that occurs within them. However, as the Northwest Passage continues to move from myth to defined possibility, that may change. Russia may want unfettered access through those straits to allow it to trade more extensively without having to rely on the Suez Canal. Thus, the claims being made over the last couple of years may simply be the tip of the iceberg, pun slightly intended, when it comes to sovereignty over the waters that will make up the Northwest Passage. The problem for Russia is that Canada holds all the cards when it comes to these straits and the Arctic islands that allow it to stake its claims. However, Moscow may find itself with an unexpected ally as it tries to expand its influence in the Arctic in the future: the United States. In an April 2020 article, Brown Political Review examined the possibility of a Northwest Passage opening up and the effect such an event could have on Canadian-US relations. It notes that the two countries are typically allies and trading partners, both are members of NATO as well, though the idea of a Northwest Passage has long been a sticking point between them. Specifically, the US disputes Canada's claims to the coastal waters that lie far above the country's northern coast, with the previously mentioned Arctic islands and the straits that run through them being part of this dispute. Canada claims these waters as their own based on both history and several cases that have been settled within the International Court of Justice. On the historical side, it argues that the long history of Inuit use of these waters make them part of Canada's territory, with the court cases backing that claim. America, on the other hand, offers its interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, as a counterpoint to Canada's argument. It accepts UNCLOS as international law, despite it never having been ratified by the US Congress as such, and claims that UNCLOS says the contested waters should be considered an international strait. In other words, nobody should have control. For decades, this dispute has simmered under the surface with no real need to resolve it. After all, the waters in question are filled with ice for the majority of the year, meaning they serve no real purpose to maritime transit. Small flashpoints have occurred, including the previously mentioned SS Manhattan issue, but neither has actively pursued a resolution. That's going to change. With the melting of the Arctic ice comes the emergence of the Northwest Passage as a potential shipping route. It's already being used as such. 20 million tons of cargo passed through the passage in 2018, but a lack of ice opens the door for billions of tons to be transported. The US argues that making the islands over which Canada claims sovereignty international waters would create an international strait. Canada could still regulate some aspects of the traffic that flows through the waterways, but it will have no right to prohibit international shipping. That would work out well for Russia. There's also a military aspect to America's claims. Over the last few years, Russia has been ramping up its military presence in the Arctic Circle. In November 2022, Reuters reported that Russia has reopened at least 10 Soviet-era military bases in the Arctic since 2005, with those bases starting to play host to modernized Russian ships. Even more worryingly, it says Russia is developing hypersonic missiles that may be installed at these bases, giving it the capacity to strike North America if needed. Right now, Russian bases within the Arctic Circle outnumber NATO bases by about a third, with Russian control over more Arctic waters potentially opening up the possibility for more bases to be created. Other Russian moves include the unveiling of a pair of nuclear submarines, as reported by CBS in December 2023, suggesting that Russia is pegging the entire Arctic region as being key to its military expansion. According to the report, NATO's footprint in the Arctic is now behind Russia's by about 10 years, which is an issue that affects both Canada and the United States. So we get a complex situation emerging. America's claims that Canadian sovereign waters should become international waters are good for both the US and Russia on the trading front. However, they may create the possibility that Russia could use this designation to start running exercises while subtly using its navy to threaten North America. In essence, Canada is fighting a battle on two fronts, one against Russian territorialism and another focused on finding a suitable compromise with the United States. Nevertheless, Canada's current situation makes it a key power broker in the emerging Arctic region. It represents such a powerful threat to Russia for several reasons. On the trading front, Canada continuing to exert its sovereignty while also using its influence in the Arctic Council to prevent Russia from expanding its territory will be key to limiting Russia's ability to trade with the rest of the world. Given the current situation in Ukraine, you could even consider this control to being vital to any future sanctions levied against Russia once the Northwest Passage opens up. Russia has also shown itself to be keen to move into Arctic waters, both through its increasing use of the North Sea route and its military buildup in the region. Beyond trade, Canada also has the ability to prevent Russia from controlling vast oil and gas reserves, as well as preventing it from overfishing in the Arctic region. Then there's the military side of things. Russia has clear plans to expand its presence in the Arctic. Canada giving up its sovereign claims could be key to that expansion, at least in terms of allowing Russia to more directly threaten the United States. But as long as Canada holds on, it becomes a threat to Russia because it's actively thwarting Putin's ambitions. It'll control any future trade within the Northwest Passage, as well as likely be more favorable to American Navy ships sailing through the straits that it currently owns. It's for these reasons that the Arctic, and the Northwest Passage in particular, has the potential to become a geopolitical flashpoint in the coming years, especially once the Arctic ice melts. But what do you think? What role will Canada play in the future of northern trade routes, and does it really have enough power to threaten Russia? How far do you think Russia will go in its efforts to exert its influence over the Arctic over the next few decades? Russia and Canada, two nations separated by oceans, yet bound by a chilling tension across the Arctic. For years, their relationship has been rocky, marked by rigid diplomacy and wary standoffs. But what started as merely icy stares across frozen waters has now evolved into something far more intense, something that promises to transform this chess game played in shadows and sub-zero temperatures into a full-scale confrontation, into a war. But what's pushing these two northern giants toward an armed conflict? We've got all the answers in this video. Now, if all those ice-cold metaphors didn't give it away already, yes, it's the Arctic Ocean that's at the heart of this brewing conflict. Simply put, Russia wants control over more of the Arctic Ocean than any nation has ever claimed. That's why in April 2021, Moscow submitted a bold request to the United Nations to extend its Arctic territory by over 270,000 square miles. If granted, this would stretch Russia's influence right into Canada's exclusive economic zone, also known as the EEZ, limits, essentially Canada's front yard. Under international law, EEZs grant each country sovereign rights over a 200 nautical mile stretch of ocean from their shores. Within this zone, countries control resource extraction, drilling, and to a degree, shipping routes. But Russia's claim went far beyond just bumping up against Canada's EEZ. It would extend over entire sections of Canada's continental shelf and also include areas claimed by Denmark, a maximalist move, as Canadian experts call it. To some, this was Russia playing by the rules, testing boundaries with scientific claims and hoping to nudge Canada, Denmark, and other Arctic nations into negotiating boundaries. But for Canada, Russia's move was more than a nudge. It was a direct challenge to its Arctic sovereignty. By 2023, this standoff only intensified. In February, the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf approved most of Russia's claim to the Arctic Ocean's seabed, including the highly contested Lomonosov Ridge, a strategic area stretching toward Canada and Greenland. Though Canada and Denmark filed overlapping claims, they're unlikely to be addressed for years, effectively giving Russia the upper hand. Of course, Russia fully embraced this. Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy at the time, made the country's intentions crystal clear. According to him, Russia needed full-scale expansion into the continental shelf. The goal? Control over nearly 70% of the Arctic Ocean. Russia also used the fact that the world's attention was focused on Ukraine to secure power and influence over the north, a dramatic flex of strength that underscores its Arctic ambitions. As a consequence of these moves, Canada finds itself in an urgent struggle, bracing for potential long-term confrontation in one of Earth's last frontiers. But why? Why would two of the world's largest nations risk so much over what seems like a frozen wasteland? Because of what lies beneath the ice: vast oil and gas reserves, strategic waterways, and essential resources that could shift the balance of power for decades to come. According to a 2008 US Geological Survey, at least 90 billion barrels of oil and 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas lies under the Arctic Ocean. If Russia were to gain control over these resources, its potential revenue could exceed $7.4 trillion. For a nation where oil and gas make up about 20% of its GDP and as much as 60% of export revenues, securing these Arctic resources isn't just desirable, it's essential. Without access to the Arctic's wealth, Russia's economic stability is at risk, a threat that has bolstered President Vladimir Putin's determination to lay claim to as much of the Arctic as possible. In his words, the Arctic waters must be protected by all means, and based on Russia's military posturing in the Arctic, it's clear that the country is quite serious about this commitment. But more on that later. For now, let's further discuss what makes the Arctic so appealing to the two potential combatants. Energy resources are only one part of Russia's interest in the Arctic. You see, global warming is melting the Arctic ice, which pushes valuable fish stocks northward as new waters open up to commercial fishing. This trend is crucial for Russia because approximately 1/3 of all fish harvested in the country already come from Arctic waters, making it a critical food source. Given that 400,000 Russians were identified as severely food insecure between 2019 and 2021, fishing rights are not just economic, but a national security priority. Expanding Russia's Arctic fishing zones could help address food shortages in a nation where remote regions rely heavily on marine resources for sustenance. But the Arctic is more than a resource bank for energy and food. It's also home to the Northern Sea Route, or NSR, and the Northwest Passage, or NWP. The former is a key waterway along Russia's northern coast, which offers the Kremlin a strategic opportunity to control a critical artery for shipping. As Arctic ice recedes, Russia hopes to convert this route into a competitive corridor that could rival the Suez Canal for Asia-Europe trade by 2035. In 2020, the Kremlin outlined an ambitious Arctic strategy, emphasizing the NSR as central to its plans for expanding Russia's economic and geopolitical influence. Increased traffic along this route would not only generate shipping fees, but also deepen Russian influence over global trade. With control over the NSR, Russia could expand its export market to Asia, an attractive option that would lessen reliance on European customers, a relationship already strained by Western sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. As for the Northwest Passage, it's a treasure trove waiting to be unlocked. A legendary route that has eluded explorers for centuries, the NWP is now poised to become maritime reality. And what does that new reality entail? Cutting shipping routes by over 4,350 miles. That's what the NWP promises. As such, this revolutionary passage could redefine global trade, making the arduous journey between the Americas, Europe, and Asia far more efficient. But why is the NWP becoming a reality just now? Two words: climate change. As Arctic temperatures soar, ice that once blocked these waterways is disappearing at an alarming rate. How alarming? Well, the Arctic is warming at a rate twice that of any other region, so the NWP could soon be free from its icy chains. By 2050, we may witness entirely ice-free summers, ushering in a new era of navigation. This means that the dream of a reliable shipping route is no longer a distant fantasy, though at a large cost to the planet. For Russia, the NWP represents an untapped potential. As the country bolsters its Atlantic capabilities, it sees the NWP as a key to unlocking greater access to trade routes. With the ice melting, Russia's ambitions only intensify. If Moscow manages to assert control over this passage, it could dominate the entire northern maritime trade. This would allow Russia to dictate terms and access to vital shipping lanes. But not so fast. There's a major obstacle in Russia's path to dominance: Canada. And Canada stands resolute. The NWP is within Canada's territorial grasp. The Prince of Wales Strait and the McClure Strait, two critical components of the NWP, are seen as extensions of Canadian territory. So for the country, the passage isn't just about trade, it's a matter of sovereignty. However, Canada also knows that its claims of sovereignty will come under fire as the NWP transitions from myth to reality. But the NWP isn't the only point of contention for Canada. Arctic resources could also funnel billions of dollars into Canada's economy and potentially secure its future as an energy powerhouse. In Canada's view, Russia's bid for control directly threatens Canadian sovereignty and the prospect of tapping into these reserves. Given that Russia already controls 53% of the Arctic coastline, Canada sees this extension effort as a blatant overreach. Beyond energy and sovereignty, Canada's fishing industry would also benefit from expanded access to the Arctic. Securing more fishing waters could support northern communities and help ensure long-term food security. Canada argues that it, too, has a historical claim to Arctic territories, particularly those contiguous to its EEZ. The competition for Arctic sovereignty underscores deep-rooted differences between Canada and Russia, but it's only part of the larger picture. The geopolitical shifts in the 2020s have also exacerbated tensions between Russia and Canada. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 7 members of the 8-member Arctic Council, which was chaired by Russia at the time, announced a boycott of any Russian-led talks. Historically, this council included both Russia and Canada as key members. However, these diplomatic ties sharply weakened for 2 reasons that went beyond the invasion of Ukraine itself. First was Canada's military assistance to Ukraine, and second was Russia's military activities in the Arctic under the backdrop of growing NATO presence along its borders. Let's tackle Canada and Ukraine's relationship first. In response to Russia's aggression, Canada made significant contributions to Ukraine, totaling almost $9 billion in financial assistance. The aid was crucial for the Ukrainian government to continue operating, delivering essential services and pensions to its citizens. Canada provided $4.86 billion through the International Monetary Fund, along with $360 million in direct bilateral loans. Furthermore, at the 2024 G7 summit, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a remarkable $5 billion in Canadian dollars to help accelerate future revenues from frozen Russian assets, amounting to an estimated $69 billion, also Canadian, which is approximately $50 billion US dollars. In addition to financial aid, Canada committed to over $258 million in humanitarian aid. This funding supported emergency health services and essential life-saving initiatives, such as shelter and food distribution for displaced populations. Security and stabilization support also saw a significant escalation, with Canada committing approximately $151 million to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities after the full-scale invasion began. This included $16.2 million dedicated to demining and explosive ordnance disposal efforts. Notably, over $14 million was aimed at enhancing Ukraine's ability to counter threats from chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. Furthermore, almost $3 million was directed to strengthen the national police of Ukraine, reflecting a comprehensive approach to ensuring stability. Although Canada's humanitarian and economic assistance to Ukraine demonstrates a profound commitment to helping it maintain its sovereignty, the most dangerous aspect of this involvement lies in the military aid provided. In little over 2.5 years, military donations from Canada totaled $3.2 billion, a significant investment that fueled Ukraine's defense. This aid included long-range weapons. However, for a long time, Ukraine wasn't allowed to use these long-range weapons to strike Russian soil to prevent further escalation. But this changed in 2024, with Trudeau arguing that strikes deep inside Russia are essential for preventing further assaults on civilian infrastructure. This bold support raised the stakes significantly as Russia interpreted these long-range strikes as a provocative escalation. Putin cautioned that allowing Ukraine to strike targets within Russian territory could lead to a confrontation between NATO countries and Russia. And given Russia's history of fabricating justifications for its military aggression, one must wonder, what's to stop it from doing the same against Canada? This concern is heightened by Russia's increasing military activities in the Arctic, the second reason why the diplomatic relationship between the two countries has all but crumbled. Over the past decade or so, Russia has ramped up its military presence in the Arctic Circle, positioning itself as a formidable force amid escalating geopolitical tensions. Moscow's aggressive stance reflects its ambitions to control Arctic resources and shipping routes while reinforcing its military infrastructure. The Northern Fleet, stationed primarily on the Kola Peninsula, plays a pivotal role in this strategy, housing 8 of the Russian Navy's 16 ballistic missile submarines. These submarines are Delta IV and Burai-class vessels, and they can carry a deadly arsenal. Each Delta IV is equipped to hold 16 SSN-23 Sineva submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, alongside the SSN-15 Starfish, an anti-submarine missile, providing both nuclear and defensive capabilities. The Burai-class submarines are even more formidable, each armed with 16 SSN-32 Bulava SLBMs, the latest in Russian missile technology designed to evade missile defenses and deliver nuclear payloads. So it's no wonder that this fleet is essential for Russia's security, forming a cornerstone of the country's nuclear deterrent. The Northern Fleet's importance in the region was also underscored by significant organizational changes, including its elevation to Russia's 5th military district. The reorganization reflects a heightened commitment to bolster the Arctic defense or offense capabilities. In 2014, Russia established an Arctic Joint Strategic Command specifically aimed at enhancing protection for military installations across the NSR. This included the creation of new Arctic brigades, equipped with advanced military technologies. Fast forward a decade, and the fleet has grown to over 450 armored personnel carriers, artillery systems, and a variety of cross-country vehicles ready for deployment. This restructuring isn't just a symbolic gesture, it's a clear indication that Russia is preparing for potential conflicts over the Arctic's vast resources. This preparation also entails establishing military bases throughout the Arctic. Since 2005, Russia has reopened at least 10 Soviet-era military bases in the Arctic, bringing these once-neglected facilities back into operational status. These bases, such as those on Wrangel Island, Cape Schmidt, and Kotelny Island, have been modernized to host a new generation of military assets, including upgraded ships and advanced air defense systems. But the Russian modernization efforts don't just stop at military bases. As part of the Northern Fleet's upgrade, new naval surface combatants are also being introduced, along with more sophisticated missiles and artillery units. The fleet now includes multiple brigade combat teams and a motorized infantry brigade, which enhances its ground capabilities. As of 2019, the Northern Fleet was reported to have 37 surface vessels, including 10 operational large vessels and the Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier, the only one of its kind in the Russian Navy. Although the aircraft carrier has faced significant operational challenges, it remains a powerful symbol of Russia's naval ambitions. The fleet also includes advanced Kirov-class missile destroyers, Slava-class guided missile destroyers, and Gorshkov-class frigates, all of which are equipped with sophisticated anti-ship and anti-air defenses and air defense systems. The fleet's air defense systems have also seen significant upgrades, with the deployment of long-range S-400 and S-300 anti-aircraft systems at strategic locations like the Kola Peninsula and the new Siberian Islands. The establishment of dual-use facilities, designed for both civilian and military purposes, further bolsters Russia's capacity to project power throughout the Arctic. And that's not all. The introduction of over 50 new icebreakers, including nuclear-powered vessels, significantly enhances Russia's operational capability in Arctic waters. To put this figure into perspective, all you need to know is that the US and China each have only 2 operational diesel-powered icebreakers. Russia's impressive fleet allows for year-round access to the NSR, enabling not only military operations, but also the facilitation of commercial shipping and energy exploration in previously inaccessible areas. On the air combat front, Russia has established 4 major air units in the Arctic. At Severomorsk, the fleet operates the 279th Shipborne Fighter Regiment with approximately 24 Su-33 fighter jets and the 100th Shipborne Fighter Regiment with 24 MiG-29K fighters. Additionally, the 98th Mixed Air Regiment at Monchegorsk operates an estimated 12 MiG-31BMs, 12 Su-24Ms, and reconnaissance aircraft. This diverse array of air assets enables Russia to maintain a robust air presence in the Arctic, ensuring rapid response capabilities in the event of a military conflict. Regular demonstrations of these capabilities, such as flights from Nagoskoye to the North Pole, serve to intimidate and signal resolve to NATO nations. But believe it or not, the list goes on. Among the most concerning developments in the Arctic region are Russia's advancements in missile technology. The Kremlin is actively developing hypersonic missiles like the Zircon, which can reportedly travel at speeds exceeding 9 times the speed of sound. These missiles have also been successfully tested in Arctic waters and are viewed as a game-changer in the realm of missile defense. The integration of hypersonic missiles into Russia's arsenal not only enhances its offensive capabilities, but also complicates NATO's defensive strategies, which rely on more traditional missile detection and interception methods. Unfortunately, there's nothing traditional or predictable about Russia's military efforts in the Arctic. In addition to the extensive military modernization infrastructure developments, Russia's military activities in the region have also been characterized by a sophisticated approach to domain awareness and electronic warfare. The Kremlin has reportedly deployed advanced radar systems, including the Resonance N, to key strategic locations such as Novaya Zemlya, the Kharnin Peninsula, and Indiga. These radar systems are designed to enhance Russia's surveillance capabilities. It's asserted that they can detect hypersonic missiles and stealth aircraft. The Resonance N system, along with other Sopka-2 radar systems installed at air bases like Temp, Nagaskoye and Rogachevo, provide Russia with a significant advantage in monitoring Arctic airspace. While the precise capabilities of these radar systems remain somewhat ambiguous, some Russian sources claim that they possess advanced over-the-horizon detection capabilities. However, it remains uncertain whether these systems can provide early enough warning against stealth aircraft to facilitate effective interception. Additionally, a dual-use air surveillance radar station on Graham Bell Island adds another layer of monitoring, showcasing Russia's comprehensive approach to securing its Arctic interests. In the realm of electronic warfare, Russia has established centers in Severomorsk, Kamchatka, and Primorsky Krai. These facilities are equipped with advanced systems that can facilitate anti-submarine warfare and disrupt maritime communications. Russia's military doctrine places significant emphasis on electronic warfare as a means of gaining a battlefield advantage, meaning they could employ the technology to jam Western communications and radars, thereby confusing adversaries and complicating their decision-making processes. Such capabilities can serve both offensive and defensive purposes, allowing Russia to maintain operational security while undermining the effectiveness of NATO forces in the region. The escalation of military exercises has also marked a significant development in Arctic security dynamics. In 2024 alone, the Arctic Military Activity Tracker found over a dozen instances of Russian military exercises or training taking place in the region. These developments indicate that the Arctic is becoming an arena of intense military competition, and the activity could easily transform into an armed clash. What's particularly troubling for this scenario is the perceived inaction of NATO and Canada in the region. As several military experts have noted, NATO's current footprint in the Arctic lags behind Russia's by approximately a decade that might be the difference between peace and peril. According to Ketil Olsen, a former Norwegian military representative in NATO, the situation is dire. The Arctic is currently a dark area on the map. It's so vast and with few civilian surveillance resources. This stark assessment highlights the urgent need for enhanced monitoring and defense capabilities in a region that's increasingly becoming a focal point of geopolitical tension. The challenges posed by Russia's military buildup are compounded by the fact that the West has not prioritized its own Arctic capabilities. General Glenn Van Herk, a retired U.S. Air Force general and former chief of the U.S. Northern Command, emphasized the need for improved domain awareness in the Arctic to counter Russian and Chinese threats. During a Senate hearing in early 2022, he pointed out that what you can't see and what you can't determine, you can't defend from. This sentence perfectly summarizes the critical gap in surveillance and intelligence capabilities that could limit the West's response in the event of a crisis. But even after a crisis struck, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the response from the Arctic allies has been slow. Canada pledged to increase military spending by $10 billion to bolster its Arctic defenses, including upgrades to early warning radar systems and the acquisition of new surveillance planes capable of detecting submarines. However, the first of these planes won't be delivered until 2032, and retired Canadian Defense Chief General Wayne Eyre has acknowledged that they will take decades to be ready. This timeline is more than troubling, especially considering that Russia's military efforts in the Arctic continue to evolve. Unfortunately, the current military situation in the Arctic is no less troubling than the future one. According to analysts, the current military balance in the region is heavily weighted in favor of Russia. The Kremlin's network of bases inside the Arctic Circle outnumbers NATO's by about a third. This reality reflects a significant strategic disadvantage for NATO and Canada, raising questions about their preparedness to effectively counter any Russian aggression in the region. But what does Canada think of all of this? Well, for one, the Canadian military undoubtedly recognizes the threat posed by Russia. That's why the country has been framed as Canada's main enemy alongside China. A 2023 military document outlined the Canadian forces' need to adapt in preparation for a long-term conflict with these nations, echoing sentiments similar to those expressed by NATO and the Pentagon. Retired Defense Chief Eyre emphasized the seriousness of the situation. "We must remember that Russia and China do not differentiate between peace and war. The hostile intentions and actions of our adversaries show that they consider themselves to be at war with the West." Eyre's acknowledgement reflects a broader understanding that the security landscape has shifted dramatically and necessitates a robust response. And yet Canada still seems to be scrambling to respond appropriately. Experts argue that Canada has been slow to respond to hostile actions, partly because of the belief that lack of actual fighting has made urgent preparations unnecessary. Eyre's employment concept paper bluntly states, "The absence of armed conflict between Canada and its adversaries has at times left the country in general, and the Canadian Armed Forces in particular, slow to respond to hostile actions." There's no doubt about it, this complacency must change as the threats posed by Russia escalate. That's why Canada's military leadership advocates for a whole-of-government approach to address the defense challenges, emphasizing the need for rapid adoption of artificial intelligence in military operations. AI would have various implications in the military, from event prediction to supporting decision-making, showcasing a forward-thinking strategy that seeks to enhance Canada's military capabilities. However, as Canada prepares to invest in its defense more heavily, significant concerns linger about its overall military readiness and the management of existing resources. Even with the potential of war growing larger with every passing day, the Canadian Armed Forces emphasizes that the country isn't on a war footing. This sentiment is echoed by various experts who stress that Canada lacks the necessary Navy, Air Force, and logistical assets to project power effectively. Let's take the Canadian military's current air capabilities as an example. The Royal Canadian Air Force operates around 263 aircraft, but most of them are aging, thus falling short of what is required to confront modern threats. At the same time, Canada's defense industry is ill-equipped for any potential confrontation. Even worse, Canada is pretty resistant to the notion of fully mobilizing its defense industry for the brewing conflict. But this shouldn't be surprising, given Canada's history in this department. You see, the Canadian federal government has avoided developing a comprehensive plan to fully mobilize resources for a conventional war for decades. This situation was exacerbated during the Cold War and has not been adequately addressed since. With this in mind, what can we expect from a Russian-Canada war? How will Canada fare in this conflict? Well, if Russia decides to attack in the Arctic, it would probably score a resounding victory, given Canada's insufficient military readiness and resource allocation. However, if Russia decided to attack Canada directly, the outcome will be far from clear-cut. Sure, on paper, Russia boasts a formidable military, far more impressive than Canada. However, the lessons from Ukraine illustrate that sheer numbers do not guarantee success. Plus, the Russo-Ukrainian war exposed significant weaknesses within the Russian military, transforming it from a seemingly invincible force into a laughingstock for the whole world. Of course, the war in Ukraine has also all but destroyed Russia's military, with the country reportedly losing roughly 700,000 troops by the end of 2024. Reports indicate that entire battalions have been decimated. One battalion from the 200th Motorized Rifle Brigade, for example, reportedly lost 645 of its 648 soldiers. The fighting in Ukraine also led to substantial attrition of armored vehicles, with thousands of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and drones confirmed destroyed. Besides lacking troops and equipment, Russia also has another major challenge to contend with: logistics. If Russia attempted an invasion of Canada, the complexity of the logistics involved would be nothing short of staggering. First and foremost, Russia currently lacks the robust logistical infrastructure necessary for a straightforward one-on-one conflict. Any Russian military campaign would likely require traversing vast distances across the ocean, a feat that is already daunting given their current struggles in Ukraine, which is just next door. Truthfully, the US might be the only country to genuinely possess these global power projection capabilities. Speaking of the US, the country would almost certainly be dragged into this conflict immediately, especially if Russia chose to move through Alaska. This could create a two-front war that Russia will be ill-equipped to handle. Throw the rest of the NATO forces into the mix, and this war would quickly become a quagmire for Moscow, putting it into a sprawling, multinational standoff it couldn't possibly sustain. But does this mean Russia wouldn't start a war against Canada? Absolutely not. Russia has proven time and again that the regime's ambitions often override logic and caution, and when these ambitions include asserting dominance in resource-rich and strategically crucial areas like the Arctic, which could save Russia's future, calculated risks seem almost inevitable. So despite Canada's reluctance to commit to a conflict, the country might not have a choice but to go to war with Russia. But how do you think this war will play out? And is there any chance of avoiding it? Share your theories in the comment section below. Now go and check out Why is Canada Russia's Greatest Threat? Or click this other video instead. How do you stop a swarm of kamikaze drones flying straight at you? That's the challenge Ukraine has faced since Russia started using Iranian-made Shahid 136 drones in 2022. These drones are fast, hard to spot, and carry enough explosives to wipe out buildings, planes, and people in one hit. Ukraine has tried advanced systems like Iris-T and Patriot, but Russia's swarm tactic, sending dozens of drones at once, makes it almost impossible to stop every single one. But now that's about to change. Ukraine is getting its hands on a German weapon that's about to shut down Russia's drone strikes for good. Enter the Gepard. In this video, we'll break down why this older anti-aircraft system is exactly what Ukraine needs right now, how they plan to use it, and the challenges they might face. But first, a question. Just how many Gepards has Ukraine received? On June 5, 2024, the Ukrainian Air Force published the first photos of the Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft systems procured for Ukraine by the United States from Jordan in Ukrainian Air Force hands. Each of these guns have been equipped with modern radar and fire control systems, and at least 60 of them are believed to be on their way. America paid $118 million to Jordan for these weapons, just under $2 million per gun, with the money coming from America's Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. The upgrades to the guns still to be delivered will be carried out in Jordan before they're shipped to Ukraine. But those aren't the only Gepards in Ukraine. In September 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported on a German military aid package that included a trio of Gepards, along with the spare parts Ukraine would need to maintain them. While not as large a package as that promised by the US, every little bit helps for Ukraine doggedly fighting back against the swarms of kamikaze drones that Russia is capable of unleashing thanks to its ties to Iran. Germany has also played a key role in training Ukrainian soldiers to use the Gepard. Army Recognition reports that a team of Ukrainian soldiers traveled to Germany to take part in an intensive 2-month training program designed to hone their ability to use the Gepard and develop algorithms for various operational situations. Those algorithms likely focused on Russia's drone-based threat, though it's equally likely that the Ukrainian trainees also learned how to use the Gepard to take out incoming cruise missiles. Either way, the training paid off. Toward the end of the 2-month program, the Ukrainian team took part in an exercise simulating the training and destruction of a training aircraft, which was itself simulating an incoming cruise missile. Using the Gepard, the Ukrainian crew was able to detect and destroy the threat, showcasing its proficiency at using the Gepard to neutralize Russian aerial assets. Those skills were put to the test for real on June 2, 2024, when that very same team used Gepard guns to shoot down 6 Shahid kamikaze drones and 18 Russian X-101, X-555, and Caliber cruise missiles during an attack on critical Ukrainian infrastructure. Not only has Ukraine received these valuable weapons, but its troops are being trained to utilize them to maximum effect and are starting to put the training to work. But what exactly is the Gepard in the first place? The Gepard is a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun that dates back to Cold War-era Germany. The weapon spent 8 years in development, with engineering crews honing its capabilities between 1965 and 1973, before it was officially introduced into military service in 1976. The weapon was made in Germany with several major contractors, including Rheinmetall, AEG Telefunken, and Krauss Maffei, combining to produce the first batch of 570 Gepards, along with 19 production vehicles, which were earlier prototypes. The gun was originally developed to confront the Soviet frontal aviation threat of the late 60s and early 70s, with a particular focus on the dangerous Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter. It sits on a lengthened Leopard 1 tank chassis, but has less armor than the Leopard 1, probably to improve portability. Each Gepard has space for a driver at the front, with the 2-man gun turret mounted in the middle. The turret is somewhat unusual when it comes to anti-air defense systems. Rather than rounds being fired from the main turret, they're fired from a pair of 35mm autocannons that are mounted on the sides of the turret. Add a search radar mounted on the top of the turret, along with a tracking radar at its front, and you get a gun that's capable of firing 2 streams of 35mm Fury in a 180-degree arc. Speaking of the autocannons, they're Oerlikon's KDAs, which are each capable of firing up to 550 rounds per minute. The rounds can be high explosive, making them ideal for destroying an aircraft's shell and frame, or armor-piercing for when the Gepard is needed to take out a ground-based target. Typically, the gunners will fire between 20 and 40 rounds at a target to take it down, with each of those rounds capable of traveling up to 2.17 miles, plenty of range to take out incoming aerial targets. As for the radar systems, the Gepard comes with 2. An S-band search radar is typically stashed at the top rear of the turret. There's also a Ku-band Doppler tracking radar fitted to the turret's front, with each of these radars having a range of 9.3 miles. The upshot of this extended range is that the gun can track an incoming threat several miles before it approaches a target, giving the gunners plenty of time to line up their shots by the time the target is within the autocannon's 2.17-mile range. The Gepard is also equipped with night vision capabilities, making it as effective in low-light conditions as it is during the day. And it has a radio, enabling the crew to communicate with reconnaissance teams on the ground to supplement its radar tracking system. Of course, such a valuable anti-air asset requires protection, which comes in the form of steel armor installed on the turret and hull. As mentioned earlier, the Gepard's armor isn't as thick as that of the Leopard 1 tanks used as the foundation of its design, but it's still 70mm thick, which makes it more than capable of protecting the weapon from small arms fire, shell splinters, and 14.5mm rounds. Unfortunately, a direct shell strike will render the gun useless. though that's no different from what would happen to a typical tank when struck by an artillery shell. In a callback to its tank-based roots, the Gepard is also equipped with smoke grenade discharges that can be used to conceal its presence from incoming threats. Last but not least, when it comes to the Gepard's special features, there's the gun's speed. The tank chassis comes into play here too, with the Gepard being equipped with the same 830 horsepower diesel engine used in the Leopard 1 tank. That kind of power gives the gun a top speed of around 40 miles per hour, which provides a high level of movability while allowing it to keep pace with troops that are on the move. It all adds up to a powerful anti-air system that can be deployed quickly, fire in all weather conditions, and only requires extremely short reaction times on the part of the gunner. And thanks to its 3-person crew, including a driver, the gun can even be moved as it fires, making it a more difficult target for incoming missiles and drones to hit. There's just one problem. It's a Cold War-era weapon. Russia has been rightfully lambasted for using Soviet-era tanks and artillery in its war against Ukraine, with these weapons often falling prey to Ukraine's advanced defensive systems. It could be argued that it's hypocritical to laud the Gepard as a game-changing weapon for Ukraine when it comes from the same era as Russia's outdated tanks. Perhaps except for 2 things. First, the Gepard was a long way ahead of its time when it was produced, and its radar systems are still more than capable of tracking incoming threats today. What's more, the turret's maneuverability, combined with these radar systems, enables the Gepard's gunners to track and attack drones and similar small threats faster than contemporary missile-based anti-air systems. After all, 550 rounds per minute will reach a target a lot quicker than a volley of missiles, which will take time to launch and travel. It might be a bit long in the tooth, but the Gepard is extremely effective at dealing with small and fast-moving targets. Forbes military writer David Axe reinforced this point in a September 2023 piece in which he lauded the Gepard as the best air defense gun in the world, even 50 years after its creation. He notes one former Gepard commander saying that the gun's radar system is so accurate that it can lock onto birds, a comment that hints at its usefulness at combating drones. Axe also points out that the 60 or so Gepards that Ukraine has received from the US and Germany in 2024 aren't the only units it's received. It also took delivery of 52 refurbished Gepards from Germany's stockpiles in April 2022, just 2 months after the war started. Around 15 of those initial 52 came from Qatar, where they'd been used to defend the Qatari skies during the 2022 FIFA World Cup tournament. Several still carried the distinctive Qatari camouflage, but more importantly, all 15 had been refurbished and maintained properly, meaning they arrived in Ukraine capable of reaching their maximum potential. That's important because condition matters with the Gepard. After all, there are only 570 in the world, and the last one was made in 1980. New Gepards simply don't exist, making it paramount for Ukraine that the Gepards they receive are properly maintained. And that brings us to the second factor that makes the aging Gepard such an effective weapon for Ukraine. A fact that can be summed up in one word: upgrades. Militarny reports that the latest batch of Gepards being delivered to Ukraine via the US aren't the originals that Germany built for itself. Instead, they're all from a batch made between 1977 and 79 for the Netherlands Armed Forces under a different contract. Those upgraded Gepards received the smokescreen system previously mentioned, in addition to the upgraded radar and Dutch guns that have greater capacity for adjustment. The radar in question operates on the X-band, rather than the S-band used for the German Gepards, and uses circular polarization rather than horizontal. That's important. Circular polarization comes with several advantages, including better tag or target readings. With the X-band, the Gepard's tagging capabilities aren't affected by the polarization of the object being tagged, meaning it achieves more reliable reads and can tag an incoming object from almost any angle. Circular polarization also offers greater depth and orientation tracking, allowing the radar to establish several tags at once, regardless of whether the targeted objects are flying in different orientations. Throw less susceptibility to signal interference into the mix, and it's clear that the latest Gepards arriving in Ukraine are even more powerful than those Germany supplied back in April 2022. They achieve more reliable readings, meaning they're capable of taking out more incoming targets. So it's clear that the Gepard is a powerful weapon, despite its age. Now we come to another question: what makes the Gepard so important to Ukraine? For starters, as the US Defense News YouTube channel points out, the Gepard was originally designed to counter low-flying attack helicopters, and the weapon still serves that purpose in Ukraine today. Since the war began, Ukraine claims to have destroyed 310 Russian helicopters, though most of those encounters took place during the first year of the conflict. It's unknown how many, if any, of those choppers were destroyed using Gepard guns, with many seemingly falling victim to drone attacks. Still, Ukraine's early success against Russia's helicopters has forced Putin to use these aerial assets sparingly since 2023. The Gepard likely plays a large role in that. The threat it presents to low-flying helicopters means Russia is far less likely to use them when trying to strike targets in Ukraine. In that sense, the Gepard is important as it serves as a deterrent. The gun's mere presence is enough to force Russia to change its strategy so that it can't offer helicopter support to its troops on the ground. However, far more important to Ukraine is the Gepard's other ability, taking out drones. They also seem to be effective in engaging small targets, such as the Iranian-made kamikaze drones that Russia uses, according to US Defense News. We touched on this earlier in the video when discussing the Shahid drones Russia has purchased from Iran and used as part of its missile strikes against multiple Ukrainian targets. Radio Free Europe provides more details about these drones. It appears Russia is using both the Shahid 136 and Shahid 131 in its kamikaze drone attacks. The Shahid 131 is an earlier version of the Shahid 136, introduced in 2021. It's smaller, weighing just under 300 pounds at takeoff and carrying a warhead weighing between 22 and 33 pounds. But its small size is advantageous as it makes the Shahid 131 difficult to track and allows it to be maneuvered into tighter spaces than the Shahid 136 is capable of reaching. As for the Shahid 136, it weighs in at a much heavier 440 pounds and is a much larger 11.4 feet long. The drone is built in the delta wing style, using rudders at its tips to keep it stable in the air. But the most dangerous thing about it is the warhead it can carry, 88 pounds of explosive installed in the nose that detonates upon impact with a target. Its range is impressive too. The Shahid 136 can travel for over 1,500 miles at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Worst of all for Ukraine, the drones are cheap. They're made using off-the-shelf components with no complicated military tech needed to get them into the sky. The cost-effectiveness has made the drones a source of derision in some circles, as they've received the mocking moniker of lawnmowers because of the distinctive sound they make when in the air. But make no mistake, cost-effective does not mean easy to tackle. These drones are fast and small enough to make them very difficult to track for most anti-air defense systems. Most, but not all. The Gepard is uniquely positioned to serve as the perfect counter to both of these threats. Given that it's capable of tracking small birds from miles away, the far bulkier Iranian drones show up on its radar long before they reach the gun's position. That early tracking gives the gunners time to aim, with the volleys of dozens of powerful rounds fired being more than enough to take out a Shahid drone long before it can deliver its explosive payload. That's precisely how Ukraine has used most of its Gepards. They're predominantly stationed near key military targets and cities that Russia is likely to strike. Rattling off hundreds of rounds per minute, Gepards are taking out Russian drones by the dozen, which brings us to another reason why the weapon is so important to Ukraine. The Gepard is a vital support system. The reason is the powerful radars built into the guns. According to the Kyiv Post, these radar systems are capable of communicating with other anti-air defenses, allowing the Gepard to serve as a spotter for the Man-Portable Air Defense System or MANPAD operators on the ground. These MANPAD operators use weapons like the American Stinger or the Soviet-era Igla to destroy larger targets than the Gepard can take down alone. So the Gepard has also become a vital component of Ukraine's mobile air defense groups. Given that it's essentially a tank in terms of its design, the Gepard can travel to a location where a strike is anticipated and start scanning the skies for incoming threats. The coordinates for larger threats, such as incoming fighter jets, cruise missiles, and Shahid 136 drones, are sent to the MANPAD operators. And of course, the gun itself starts firing as soon as any of those targets come within its 2.17-mile range. The result is an integrated mobile anti-air defense approach, whereby Ukraine can use the Gepard both for its firing capabilities and to help other anti-air systems take out incoming threats. You can see why, for Ukraine, the Gepard is such a powerful addition to its aerial defenses. However, the weapon is not without challenges. The Kyiv Post points out that for all its power, the Gepard still comes from the Cold War era. As a result, it isn't rational for Ukraine to deploy it on the front lines or use it for its original purpose of shooting down low-flying helicopters. Some modern Russian attack helicopters are capable of launching anti-tank missiles from ranges of up to 6.2 miles, far outside the range of a Gepard's guns. That doesn't mean the weapon is useless against helicopters. Any that fly within its range are likely to get shredded before the pilot even knows what's happening. But deploying the Gepard on the front lines would give Russia opportunities to fire on it from miles behind the front lines. The gun's age would also factor against it here, as the 70mm thick steel armor installed around the turret isn't strong enough to stop modern anti-tank munitions. As a result, Ukraine doesn't risk its valuable Gepards by deploying them on the front lines. It keeps them back to defend key military installations, or sends them out of part of a roving air defense force to take out incoming missiles and drones. Another challenge lies in the limited number of Gepards that were produced. Despite the weapon's effectiveness, only 570 were ever made, with the most recent being manufactured in 1980. That means the newest Gepard gun is still over 40 years old, which creates a host of problems when it comes to maintenance and simply sourcing usable units. The Gepards that Ukraine has either received or is due to receive account for close to a fifth of all the Gepards in existence. And each of those units has been properly maintained, refurbished, and, in some cases, upgraded for use against Russia. If Ukraine needs more of them, where can it get them? In fact, how many Gepards are there even left to get? Brazil has 34 of the weapons, none of which are likely to find their way to Ukraine. Despite supporting the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, Brazil hasn't provided any military aid. The country's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, claims that he wants to end the war between Russia and Ukraine rather than join it, which puts the kibosh on any chance of Brazil's 34 Gepards arriving in Ukraine. But Ukraine may have more luck with Romania. The country has provided military aid to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, including a Patriot missile launcher and multiple armored vehicles. And Romania is the home of the Borcea Base 86, which is where Ukraine's pilots have been training to fly F-16s. The country also has 41 Gepard guns, though it's committed none of them to Ukraine so far. That may change in the future, but for now, it means that another 41 of the 570 Gepards are out of Ukraine's reach. Add Brazil's stockpiles to that number, and you get 75 Gepards that Ukraine can't access. As for other countries, Belgium once owned 55 Gepard guns, though it withdrew them from service and sold them all to private companies. Add that to the total of unavailable Gepards and you have 130. Chile also ordered 30 Gepard guns in 2008, only to withdraw them from service 3 years later. A proposed upgrade program for those 30 Gepards failed, and it's likely that they're now unsuitable for use in Ukraine. Even if they're still fully functioning, Chile appears to be taking a similar approach to Brazil in that it supports Ukraine's sovereignty, but it isn't actively sending military aid. That's another 30 Gepards crossed off the list, bringing the total unavailable to Ukraine to 160. As for the rest of the Gepards that aren't in Ukraine, most are owned by Germany and the Netherlands, of which the latter still has 35 Gepards after selling 60 of its original stock of 95 to Jordan. Those are the 60 Jordanian guns that the US has purchased to send to Ukraine. But what of the remaining 35, plus the several hundred owned by Germany? Sadly, none of those Gepards are likely to find their way to Ukraine. The Netherlands withdrew their guns from service in 2006, placing them in storage and likely decommissioning them. The same goes for the majority of the German Gepards, which were all phased out by 2012 due to their high maintenance costs. Even if these guns are still in storage, they haven't been maintained for well over a decade and may no longer be viable. So it's very possible that the Gepards Ukraine has are all of the Gepards that it's going to get. There's a similar problem with the ammo. When the Gepard was first manufactured, ammunition production was contracted out to Switzerland, which exclusively made the 35mm ammo that the weapon uses. Ukraine needs more ammunition. In its way is Switzerland's policy of neutrality, which has been in place since 1515. Though that policy has come under increasing pressure during the Ukraine war, with Switzerland having provided some non-military aid to Ukraine, the country has refused to create more of the ammunition Ukraine needs for its Gepard guns. Thankfully, Rheinmetall has come to the rescue. One of the original manufacturers of the Gepard, the company received a contract to produce 300,000 rounds of 35mm ammunition for the Gepard in February 2023, with the first shipment being delivered to Ukraine in September of the same year. Those rounds can't come quick enough for Ukraine, especially as the Gepard can burn through several thousand of them in a single engagement involving multiple drones. And that brings us back to what the Gepard can do on the battlefield and how it complicates things for Putin's air force. Ukraine now has a steady supply of ammunition for this powerful aerial defense platform, along with a promise that 60 more Gepard guns are on their way, courtesy of the US. Those guns will prove vital in defending against incoming drones and helping manpad operators on the ground to target larger threats. This is a huge problem for Russia's air force. It now faces a reinvigorated weapon with a new purpose, taking down a core component of Russia's aerial assault. With Gepards in place, Ukraine is much better equipped to defend itself against the missile and drone strikes upon which Putin has increasingly relied during the Ukraine war. Ukraine's challenge now is protecting the Gepards it already has from Russian countermeasures, because once the 60 from Jordan have all arrived, that's likely to be the last they'll get. But what do you think about the Gepard? Do you think this Cold War-era gun has the power to severely impact Russia's aerial threat? Will Ukraine risk using these guns on the front lines, and if they do, how do you think they'll fare against Russian bombs and artillery? When Sweden's Civil Defense Minister Carl-Oskar Bolin said there could be war in Sweden, urging the citizens of Sweden to start preparing for war mentally, many were left wondering the same thing. Why would a country that didn't fight at all in the world wars and who hasn't fought in more than 200 years suddenly announce that they need to be ready for war? This statement has sparked a lot of controversies, with people asking questions like, is it because Sweden realized its intention to join NATO? Is it because Russia invaded Ukraine? Will Russia invade Sweden? All these might be true, or it might be that even though Vladimir Putin might be considering invading Sweden as part of his grand plans, the real reason is that he's scared of Sweden, more specifically of the JAS-39 Gripen. Today, we'll take a look at why the supersonic JAS-39 Gripen makes Sweden's air force so powerful, and the reason why it might make Putin think twice before finally deciding to invade. But before we get to that, just why are the politics of the Baltic region and NATO so important? Many will have heard of the Baltic region, but if you haven't, well, it's the region of countries that surrounds the Baltic Sea, which includes Russia, Finland, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden. All these countries had been coexisting relatively peacefully until Russia realized that all the other countries in the Baltic region had joined NATO, a fact that doesn't sit well with Russia and was one of the reasons for its invasion of Ukraine. NATO and Russia have a long history dating back to the period after World War II, when Russia was still part of the USSR. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 by the USA, Canada, and many Western European nations, with a primary aim to provide security against the USSR. Ever since its creation, there has been a Cold War between NATO and the USSR for dominance. With the USSR's dissolution in 1991, the tension in Eastern and Western Europe was supposed to stop, but Russia just continued where the USSR left off. However, there have been a couple of treaties between NATO and Russia, including the Founding Act in 1997, which improved the partnership between Russia and NATO. Even though it never became a part of NATO, Russia had permanent residence and access to NATO's headquarters in Brussels. However, this relationship completely broke down when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Ever since, there has been no conciliation between NATO and Russia, but there was the implied agreement that NATO would keep its Cold War policies in as much as Russia keeps its army and troops in Eastern Europe. However, although NATO has not moved in physical might, they have been expanding their influence towards Eastern Europe, which is what Putin doesn't like. And that was one of the things he mentioned before going into Ukraine. If Ukraine joins NATO and decides to take Crimea back through military means, European countries will automatically get drawn into a military conflict with Russia. And now, a similar thing is happening again, but this time not with the land borders of Russia, but the maritime border in the Baltic region. All of the countries there are now part of NATO, with Sweden being the most recent to join. So what's the current relationship between Sweden and Russia? While we can say that joining NATO has unequivocally created more tension between the countries, the two have not exactly been friends for some time. Back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the EU placed sanctions on Russia, and Sweden voted for them. In retaliation, Russia added all countries in the EU to their list of unfriendly nations. In response, Sweden and many of the countries in turn labeled Russia persona non grata. But the animosity between the two countries began long before 2022. The two countries have a long history of conflicts, dating back centuries, including the Finnish War, where in 1809, Russia took control of Finland from Sweden. During World War II, Sweden had proclaimed neutrality, but it still borrowed some planes from Finland when Russia, then the Soviet Union, invaded it. Even though Sweden was neutral in the war, it had a pact with the US that in a situation where the Soviet Union tried to invade Sweden, the US would come to Sweden's defense, but that never happened. Also, there is the incident of the Soviet Union shooting down two jets that belonged to Sweden in the 1950s, one belonging to the Swedish government and one to a civilian. But it didn't stop there. In 1981, Sweden discovered a Soviet Union Whiskey-class submarine in its waters, and it took up to 10 days before a diplomatic agreement that returned that submarine to the Soviet Union could be reached. All these point to the fact that both Sweden and Russia have had it back and forth with each other, so there is definitely an historical precedent if another attack on Sweden is suggested. And with Russia invading Ukraine, the idea is not far-fetched. But should Sweden actually be expecting an invasion? Ever since the invasion of Ukraine, the countries surrounding Russia have unsurprisingly started spending heavily on their militaries. Most neighboring countries to Russia like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who were formerly under the USSR, just like Ukraine, believe there is a possibility that Russia could invade them in the future, just like they did Ukraine. These countries are relatively small, but even Poland, a relatively large country neighboring Russia and Ukraine, is also unnerved by Russia's erratic actions and is strengthening their military might. Also, these countries are members of NATO, which means in Putin's head, they are threats to the security of Russia. These countries will take their military strength seriously if Russia decides to come at them. There's even a prediction from Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who said that NATO should be prepared to face Russia in 3 to 5 years. Even though Sweden doesn't have a land border with Russia, the maritime border they share, and Russia's behavior in the past have prompted Sweden to strengthen their military might as well. This was evident in the information the Swedish government passed out in 2022 about increasing military spending to 2% of the country's GDP. As explained by the Swedish defense minister, the reason for this is that the country is facing the most serious security policy situation since the end of World War II. As of 2024, the defense bill was drafted in which 2% of the country's GDP would go to military spending, a whopping 27 billion krona, equivalent to $2.3 billion. This money is supposed to go toward their NATO membership payment and developing the military, especially their air force, which is one of the reasons why Putin will need to be careful before thinking about invading. Which brings us to the real reason why Putin should be scared of Sweden, or more specifically, its air force. Since Sweden hasn't been involved in a war in a very long time, many people don't know about the country's true military might, especially what they can do in the air. The Swedish Air Force, or SWAF, was created in 1926, and even though this arm of the military did not have the chance to perform during the Second World War due to the country's neutrality, they are extremely effective, both on paper and in reality. The real beginning of the strength of the Swedish Air Force stems back to when the country decided to heavily invest into nuclear weapons research. It may not seem like this would lead to a powerful air force, but stay with us. Faced with the hostile presence the Soviet Union posed after World War II, and to protect themselves from likely future assault, Sweden, under the guise of civilian defense, started researching their own nuclear weapons. The project was fairly successful and progressed to the stage where underground testing was possible, but the Riksdag, Sweden's supreme decision-making body, decided that the exploration of nuclear energy shouldn't be used to build weapons, but instead to create a defense against nuclear attacks. And this is what would lead to a more powerful air force, as much of the money that had been pouring into developing nuclear weapons was now diverted to the air force. The beginning of investment that surged Sweden forward and placed them among the countries with the best air forces in the world. Around that time in the 1950s, the Air Force then decided to use the large funding to start the creation of their domestic aircraft. As a result of all the money well spent, during the Cold War, Sweden became the world's fourth most powerful air force with about 1,000 modern planes, which introduced the Saab A-32 Lansen, Saab J-29 Tunnan, and the Saab J-35 Draken. And that was just the beginning. Now, thanks to that lineage, Sweden has created arguably one of the best fighter jets in the world, the single-engine supersonic multi-role fighter jet JAS-39 Gripen. When the prototype was demonstrated in 2009, the fighter jet reached the supersonic speed of Mach 1.2, or around 913 miles per hour. And it did this without the use of an afterburner, making it better for higher range and giving it fuel-saving advantages. The Gripen has several variants, including the Gripen JAS-39C and D, as well as the JAS-E and F. The only difference between the C and D is that the C is a single-seater, while the D has room for two, same for the E and F. And even though the C, D, and EF are fairly similar, the EF is the newer, updated version. Both have features that would make anyone think twice before getting into an aerial battle with Sweden, even Putin. The Gripen JAS-39CD is powered by a Volvo RM12 engine, with an afterburner capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2, and can operate at heights over 49,000 feet, or 15,000 meters, without issue. Although it's equipped with sophisticated avionics, it's the Gripen's arsenal that truly gives it an edge over its rivals, thanks to a 27mm cannon and 8 hardpoints for missiles and bombs, which means it can both win duels in the air and destroy targets on the ground. The Gripen JAS-39EF, which is the newer version, is an even more dangerous multi-role combat aircraft that's capable of air fighting and ground-based air attack missions, thanks to its increased payload, longer range, and more advanced electronic warfare capabilities. It also has a more powerful engine, the General Electric F414 GE39, which also has a top speed of Mach 2, but a higher operational ceiling of 52,000 feet, or 16,000 meters. Having such a powerhouse in the sky makes one thing very certain: no one would want to mess with them. Putin is even one of the few world leaders who should want to engage in an aerial battle with Sweden. Even though Russia is one of the top 3 air forces in the world on paper, they are facing a lot of trouble converting those stats into real-life results. This was made evident very quickly when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Russia's supersonic fighter jets like the Su-34 and Su-57 that were supposed to dominate the Ukrainian airspace started to fall to manpad-launched surface-to-air missiles. Many of Russia's fighter jets were seen running from the battlefield, and some pilots even abandoned their jets because they weren't effective enough. If even manpads can stop Putin's air attacks, think about what supersonic, hyper, and recently updated Gripens would do. The Su-34 and Su-57 wouldn't stand a chance. But as we've seen, losses don't always dissuade Putin, so what would really happen if Russia decides to invade Sweden? Will Sweden be able to protect itself, or will it end up on the receiving end like Ukraine? There are many who think that because Sweden is relatively small, that it will be an easy target. But as we've seen, Sweden has an ace up their sleeve in their air defense, and it isn't all due to their powerful fighter jets. Sweden has prioritized military advancement after the end of the Second World War, and they've been able to hone their craft well enough that any country that wants to attack or invade them would have a really tough time doing so. And because Sweden isn't necessarily interested in expanding its territories into other countries, its military weapon system development has focused more on defense than attack. Because of the small territory, they've created and honed strategically the best weapons for their defense position. Sweden not only has the Gripen JAS as a monument for military advancement, but they also have one of the best anti-tank missiles, the NLAW, the best anti-ship missiles, the RBS-15 family, and one of the world's best submarines. This means Sweden has a solid air, water, and ground game when defending its region from hostility. If Putin wants to try invading Sweden, he'd have a hard time even entering Swedish airspace, let alone standing toe-to-toe with the Gripen. It's imperative that any country that considers invading Sweden not underestimate the military capabilities of its air force, and specifically its advanced fighter jets. But what do you think? Could Russia pull off an invasion of Sweden? Would the Russian Air Force be able to take on the Gripen JAS-39?
When you're trying to conquer one of the largest areas in Eastern Europe, a little over 233,000 square miles to be exact, which is roughly the size of Texas, and you're running low on tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, aerial drones, and trained military personnel, you can be pretty sure you're failing miserably. Add an increasingly evaporating number of military aircraft to the equation, and it's time to hit the panic button. Be it land or sky, Putin just can't seem to hold on to his weapons, and it's not just embarrassing, it's downright self-destructive. In the case of aerial warfare, it is disastrous. For Russia, of course. Here's the thing. Air power should have been Putin's biggest advantage in Ukraine. When Putin's invasion began in February of 2022, experts and analysts were seriously gloomy about the smaller country's ability to defend its airspace. Most assumed that Russia's much-vaunted air force, the VKS, would be able to quickly overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and gain a decisive early advantage in the conflict. Even the most optimistic assessments assumed that Russia's air campaign would destroy Ukrainian jets on their bases, while using large-scale ballistic and cruise missile strikes to blind the country's surface-to-air missile radars. This would have forced Ukraine to move its SAM systems away from the front lines, leaving it at a severe early disadvantage and increasingly vulnerable to Russian sorties. But these predictions, often from top conflict analysts, proved to be completely wrong. In more than a year of war, Russia has utterly failed to establish air superiority, while managing to lose staggering quantities of its jets and other assets. In fact, the situation is so bad that earlier this month, one pro-Russian blogger on Telegram, usually cheerleaders for the invasion, stated that the country's air force has engaged in complete idiocy and is detached from reality. Definitely not a good look for Putin. So how has this colossal embarrassment happened? As usual, there's no single answer here. But like other aspects of Russia's failure in Ukraine, it has a lot to do with the long-term issues plaguing the country's military: corruption, bad strategies, poor training, and more. These certainly aren't new issues, but the war in Ukraine has exposed how much they've come to affect Russian capabilities. To get a better picture of how this has happened, let's start with a super quick look back at both fighter jets and air defense systems from the starting point of the most exciting eras in aircraft development: the Jet Age. The so-called Jet Age kicked off in the late 1940s, spurred by profound changes in the field of aeronautics. The jets developed during this period could fly faster, higher, and farther than older piston-powered aircraft. This would soon come to transform the aviation industry in both its commercial and military forms. By using the technology of jet propulsion, many pilots believed they could outrun their enemies in the skies and theoretically create total air superiority. Using jet propulsion, aircraft could vastly increase their speed, a major reason why aircraft-mounted guns were mostly replaced by missiles. By far the most reliable way to shoot a supersonic jet out of the sky. Still the go-to weapon for aerial combat today, aerial missiles also revolutionized the nature of air defenses. Today they rely almost entirely on surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, to prevent hostile attacks from the sky. And from the 1970s onwards, it also became possible for infantry troops to take down aircraft with their own portable handheld anti-aircraft missiles. These man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, are highly cost-effective shoulder-fired rockets able to lock onto aircraft using infrared homing. They are also easy to use, able to be taught to new recruits in a matter of minutes or hours. And since the start of last year, Ukrainians have shown the world just how valuable MANPADS can be. As Putin's invasion began, Western nations assumed the Russian Air Force would be among the most significant challenges for Ukrainian defenders. When Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov visited Washington in November 2021 to press for weapons, he reportedly told American officials, "We have to prepare now. Point number one is air defense." So NATO members sent thousands of MANPADS into Ukraine to shore up the country's surface-to-air capabilities. Among others, these weapon transfers have included American-made Stingers, high-velocity British Starstreak missiles, and even surplus Soviet EGLOS systems. And this decision really paid off. These comparatively cheap air defenses managed to stop Russia from obtaining air superiority by imposing asymmetrical costs on any Russian pilot dumb enough to enter Ukrainian airspace. For example, using one 60,000 to 80,000 EGLA missile, Ukrainian soldiers have been able to down a $36 million Su-34 bomber or an $85 million Sukhoi Su-35S fighter jet. This huge cost differential has had effects across the battlespace in Ukraine. Because modern combined arms warfare is highly dependent on air support, Russia's failure to dominate the skies has had serious repercussions. The inability to provide sufficient air cover for its tanks, infantry, artillery, or supply lines is one of the reasons Russian forces have taken such devastating losses. Caught in the open, these troops have been falling prey to a range of Ukrainian ambushes from hidden positions on the ground. But does the failure by Russia to achieve air superiority mean a lack of Russian aircraft? Kind of, but not exactly. Ukrainian troops near the front lines around Bakhmut have told reporters that Russia continues to fly daily sorties in hopes of catching their targets unaware. Most of these flyovers last only moments. Russian fighter jets or bombers, often flying in groups of 4, fly at low altitude over a target area before quickly dropping or firing their payloads and hightailing it back to their bases. Less maneuverable attack helicopters will also fly right up to the line of combat before firing their missile salvos and quickly fleeing to safety. Another reason for this is the recent addition of the powerful Slovakian S-300 missile defense system to Ukraine's arsenal. This longer-range surface-to-air missile can target Russian jets at higher altitudes, forcing them to fly lower to screen themselves from attack. And in turn, the lower-altitude flights have made them extremely vulnerable to shoulder-mounted missile systems. Because of the medium-range S-300s and shorter-range threat posed by Ukrainian MANPADS, no Russian air assets are able to spend extended periods of time near the front. Despite the obvious difficulty of shooting down even a low-flying aircraft, the Ukrainian strategy seems to be working pretty well. One report from mid-May 2023 suggested that Ukraine had downed 4 aircraft in a single day of fighting. While Ukrainian commanders would not confirm their role in the attack, the country's defense ministry stated that the Russian craft ran into some trouble. Numbers like this highlight the focused and effective use of MANPADS, with soldiers using constant vigilance around the clock to exploit the tiny 3 to 5 second firing window. Ukraine's surprising ability to contest its airspace was also partly what allowed it to go on the offensive late last year. Some of this was done with Turkish-made Bayraktar drones, which were used to destroy high-value targets like Russian surface-to-air missiles. This strategy, one that Russia has failed in executing itself, allowed Ukraine to launch more attacks from the air without fear of being shot down. Ukraine also used what limited air power it had in some very creative ways. During the sinking of the Russian Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, Ukraine used a drone to distract the ship's anti-air capabilities before launching a salvo of Neptune anti-ship missiles before the unlucky crew could react. Other tactics have included dispersing aircraft and air defense units out of major airfields vacating certain air defense positions before they could take any losses from Russian fire, and operating their air defense SAM batteries as pop-up units, rather than large batteries with support vehicles. This final tactic proved to be extremely valuable, stopping Russian forces from effectively targeting most of Ukraine's air defenses. While we now take for granted that Ukrainian soldiers will find creative and deadly ways to use its lesser capabilities, it is still no small feat. In fact, the creative use of air power highlights that Ukraine may now have a better understanding of air operations than even many NATO countries. David A. Deptula, a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General, has argued that the West can actually learn from Ukraine here. We've become so dominant in the air that we've never had to think through how we would use air power if we were the inferior force, he said. Ukraine is posing us some very interesting questions that we should seriously consider, if only to understand how a clever opponent would take us on. Russia, on the other hand, has continually failed to learn from their abysmal performance in the skies. And as with so much else, Russia's systemic failure to establish air superiority also points to the larger issues within the country's military. This became noticeable early on in Ukraine when, rather than overwhelming force, only 1 or 2 aircraft at a time conducted strikes against targets in and around Ukrainian cities close to the borders, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Mariupol. And when pilots missed their targets, they very rarely mounted follow-up strikes. At that same time, Russian military planners apparently made no plans for large-scale bombardments of air defenses themselves. In fact, they have seemed entirely unable to coordinate the large, complex formations necessary for fighter jets and helicopters to cover each other from enemy fire. More than almost anything else, this helps explain Russia's baffling inability to establish control over the skies, despite its qualitative and quantitative advantages. Western air forces have long taken for granted the ability to coordinate the timing and positioning of their attacks in campaigns like the Balkans, Iraq, or Libya. However, the level of planning, logistical, and command and control capacity needed for such air campaigns is massive. Every pilot needs to coordinate and understand their role in the broader operation, including the exact timing and route needed to strike multiple targets. Tanker support is also critical to ensure refueling can take place at established rendezvous points. The complexity only increases once actual combat begins, as various fighters tasked with destroying air defenses, those engaging enemy aircraft, bombers, electronic warfare escorts, and search and rescue teams must all work seamlessly together and adapt at a moment's notice. Russia has failed on basically all of these fronts. Many Russian pilots are trained to fly exclusively in pairs or fours, with little exposure to larger maneuvers or formations. They also get far fewer flying hours than NATO crews, do not have tanker support for most operations, and are not trained in large-scale aerial combat doctrine. Lacking all these elements, it's no wonder that Russia could not carry out a Western-style air war against Ukraine. And even in the instances where the Russian Air Force scored victories against Ukrainian positions, they were unable to capitalize on those strikes due to fear of manpads and larger surface-to-air missile systems. When Russia refocused its troops in the Donbas region during April of 2022, they were able to gain some localized air superiority near the new front lines, mainly through the use of artillery strikes against Ukrainian SAMs. But even when they were actually able to gain this limited control of the skies, Russia utterly failed to turn it into any type of concrete battlefield advantage. As one analyst from the London-based Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, put it, the primary reason for this is that despite having more than 300 modern fast jets with theoretically flexible capabilities to carry a range of air-to-air and air-to-ground munitions, most Russian aircrew have very limited opportunities to drop precision-guided munitions in realistic training scenarios. Another major factor is actually hitting their targets, as many of Russia's jets do not have targeting pods, a standard feature on most Western military aircraft. In fact, while Russia's Su-34 fleet of jets have forward targeting systems and can use precision-guided munitions, they're just about the only ones. The rest of Russia's fighter jets have very limited capability to identify and destroy any battlefield targets which do not show up on radar. This means they've pretty much been limited to attacking fixed targets with satellite or TV-guided weapons, or dropping unguided bombs and rockets at predetermined coordinates. One observer noted they are literally cratering empty fields, while an anonymous official from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency told reporters early this year that under half of all Russian missiles are hitting their aim point. We're holding Russian missile success at just below 40%. In Donbass, this incredibly poor performance has meant Russian jets cannot effectively support ground operations, leaving troops open to a range of ambushes and other tactics. But how did the Russian Air Force end up in such a sad state, especially when Putin ordered a modernization of the fleet just a decade ago? The answer, as with so many things in Russia, seems to be a product of the country's structural issues. While the modernization was supposedly intended to make modern combined force operations easier, it appears to have been mostly for show. One part of this has been inefficiency and widespread corruption. For example, in 2012, one Russian arms company received nearly $26 million to develop an aircraft system for intercepting non-strategic missiles. But the research never actually happened. The company signed the fraudulent contracts with shell companies, the addresses of which were registered to the addresses of public toilets in the Russian city of Samara. In another case from 2016, one company responsible for supplying radio navigation equipment and control systems for guided munitions had a similar scandal. Its top leadership were caught in an embezzlement scheme where they faked research and development techniques in order to steal millions through fraudulent contracts. This type of corruption is common and widespread, also reaching beyond Russia's military-industrial complex and into the top levels of its political elite. So much personal wealth is on the line that some experts argue it has completely changed the incentive structure for Putin's top officials. Most of these individuals own property far beyond their official levels of income, signaling a range of corrupt deals. In turn, these security officials have less incentive to give actual expert advice, which could disappoint Putin and lose them access to their sweet kickbacks. And as mentioned before, poor training and an inflexible command structure compounds these issues. As Phillips O'Brien, professor of strategic studies at University of St. Andrews, has written, though much was made of the flashy new equipment, such as the much-hyped Su-34 strike aircraft, the Russian Air Force continues to suffer from flawed logistics operations and the lack of regular, realistic training. Above all, the autocratic Russian kleptocracy does not trust low-ranking and middle-ranking officers, and so cannot allow the imaginative, flexible decision-making that NATO air forces rely upon. So when Russian pilots actually have a chance to act flexibly and change their attacks to hit something, bad commanders and rigid doctrine do not allow them to improvise. Instead, they have to try to pull off their standing orders, even if those are likely to fail or lead to their untimely demise from Ukrainian air defenses. It really doesn't look like the situation will get better for the Russian Air Force either. The VKS has shown no sign of changing tactics and seems very hesitant to even use its best jets in the field. This might be because Western sanctions have hit the Russian aerospace industry particularly hard, quickly eroding Russia's ability to obtain the components needed to produce new advanced fighter jets. This became evident in a January call where Putin publicly attacked Denis Manturov, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Trade and Industry. Previously a favorite of Putin, Manturov was humiliated when he explained that the country was unable to obtain the contracts needed for new parts. One Moscow-based defense analyst even told reporters that you have to ask yourself if Manturov is going to be the next one of Putin's cronies you read about mysteriously falling out of a window somewhere. But the corruption, sanctions, and mounting losses of aircraft in Ukraine seem to have made actually getting the parts an impossible task. This is pretty obvious when we take a look at Russia's 3 production facilities for Sukhoi aircraft. Despite their massive size, analysis from last year shows that they only produced 31 aircraft during 2022, falling far short of the orders placed in state defense contracts. Essentially, as Rand Corporation analyst John V. Paracchini recently put it, Russia's aerospace sector isn't likely to have aircraft to sell, even if it wants to. At the end of March 2023, Ukraine's Armed Forces General Staff claimed at least 305 aircraft had been destroyed since the start of the war. While Russia has reportedly even resorted to stripping the microchips from household appliances to replace its losses, it isn't nearly enough. One Ukrainian defense executive stated that production for some of the most critical subsystems for Russian fighters has almost seized up. Problematic items like the Su-35's Irbis passive electronically scanning array radar antenna can require a year or more, and that is in times of no embargoes, no supply disruptions. These problems are even greater for Russia's fleet of bombers, such as the Tupolev Tu-95 and Tu-22M3. While Russia has maintained some domestic production capacity for its fighter jets over the years, mainly due to demand from abroad, this isn't the case for bombers. Once the current fleet begins to break down, there is literally no way for Russia to replace them. This is one of the main reasons why many analysts and experts now call Russia's equipment losses in this area irreversible, with no chance of restoring stockpiles to pre-war levels. The situation for Russia's Air Force is also likely to get worse once Ukraine begins receiving the Western F-16s. Retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hampton stated in a recent interview that compared to an F-16, the Russian Su-35 is essentially junk, adding that our planes are more durable. I wouldn't bet in combat on the Su-35 or any Russian-made aircraft. F-16s are versatile multi-role combat aircraft, which come in 1- and 2-seater models. Since 1979, the F-16 has been continuously upgraded, giving the newer models advanced radar and other capabilities. With a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour, a 33-foot wingspan, and 50-foot length, Hampton points out that the F-16 is very hard to see because it's smaller than most aircraft, especially when it's aimed directly at you. Each also has one M61A1 20mm multi-barrel cannon and can carry 6 air-to-air missiles. While this payload can pack a serious punch, the Russian planes should also be deadly if used correctly. The Su-35 is a twin-engine, single-seat fighter jet, which the RAND Corporation has called Russia's signature heavy fighter bomber. While the Su-35 is reportedly faster than the F-16, able to reach Mach 2, it does not have the same powerful active electronically scanned array radar, making it a more vulnerable and obvious target. Colonel Hampton has pointed out that the Su-35 is easy to use, easy to pick up on radar, and easy to shoot at with a long-range missile. Part of this is because it's such a large plane, with a 50-foot wingspan and a length of nearly 70 feet. And as Hampton stated, the Su-35 is a typical Russian machine and looks good, but deep down it's not really that good of a plane. But which jet is actually superior? Well, it really might come down to who is using it. As David Jordan, co-director of the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London, pointed out, that on paper, it can be argued that the Su-35 has an edge over the sorts of F-16s the Ukrainians are likely to get, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Like anything else, the effectiveness of each jet will depend largely on its pilot, their training, and the tactics they employ. Seeing as Ukrainians have already held their own so effectively, there is reason to believe this won't change soon. Combined with their use of manpads, Jordan has argued that I would suspect that the F-16s in Ukrainian hands will represent a formidable challenge. Other experts suggest that the context in which a battle occurs will determine how well the F-16s stack up to the Su-35. Retired British Royal Air Force Commodore Andrew Curtis told Newsweek that if it comes to dogfighting, the F-16 is still one of the best in the world. However, the Russian pilots are likely to try and fight a standoff battle using medium and long-range missiles. If they can do this successfully, that may tilt the balance in the Su-35's favor. But regardless, it seems unlikely that Russia will be able to achieve more than the brief localized air superiority it held last year. Since Ukraine's capabilities are only growing, with more and more Western support, there is little chance of Russia making any real gains. With Russia hemmed in by manpads and other surface-to-air systems, and unable to replace or make more of their advanced jets, it seems only a matter of time before Ukraine starts to retake the airspace in its east. So, to sum things up, it has truly been a terrible year for the VKS. The war in Ukraine has exposed its fundamental weaknesses, while sanctions and enormous losses have seriously harmed its future outlook. Unable to even use the advanced jets it currently has correctly, Russia's Air Force is not likely to see any improvement soon. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been able to adapt and use superior tactics to overcome its numerical weaknesses. Once the Ukrainian Air Force gets its hands on some F-16s, the tide of war may turn even faster. But what do you think? Why has Russia's Air Force been failing so badly? And will Ukraine continue to hold its own in the skies?
The S-400 air defense system has become a hot commodity on the global stage, hailed as the crown jewel of military hardware. From Algeria's acquisition in 2021 to Belarus beefing up its arsenal in 2022 to counter NATO, and even China securing units to guard the contentious Senkaku Islands and Taiwan from 2018, the S-400's client list reads like a who's who of global powers. India joined the club with a whopping $5.3 billion deal in 2018, undeterred by political sanctions from its ally, the United States. Meanwhile, Turkey, a NATO member, faced real sanctions, trading access to the F-35 program for the Russian defense system. The widespread adoption and the risks nations are willing to take to possess the S-400 beg the question, is it really the ultimate shield it's cracked up to be? Can it truly outsmart fifth-generation stealth fighters? In this video, we're diving deep into the world of the S-400, examining its strengths, shortcomings, and debunking myths. We'll also talk about why its NEBO-M radar system sucks, and how its lack of interceptors make it vulnerable compared to other air defense systems out there. And we also look into questions like, can Putin's prized air defense system pinpoint and neutralize US fighters before they deploy their arsenal or coordinate a strike from afar? Let's see what our military experts have to say. But first, it's origin story time. Russia's S-400 Triumph is an evolution of the Cold War-era S-300 air defense system. It's a mobile system capable of shooting down aircraft, drones, and cruise missiles. It also has a terminal ballistic missile defense capability. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the S-400 has the mission equivalent to the United States' Patriot missile defense system. Born amidst the post-Soviet turmoil of the early 90s, the S-400, a successor to the formidable S-300, emerged not as a reinvention, but as an evolution. With 70 to 80% of its technology rooted in its predecessor, how did Russia enhance this system to meet the modern battlefield's demands? The leap from S-300 to S-400 brought significant advancements, upgraded radars, new missiles extending its reach, and fortified defenses against electronic attacks. But with these improvements, just how much more effective did the S-400 become? Introduced in 2007, boasting a range of up to 400 kilometers and the capability to engage 80 targets at once, the S-400 represents a leap in defensive technology. Each battalion's 8 launchers, equipped to fire 4 missiles each, stand ready to challenge the skies. But that's not all. The S-400's primary weapon system is the 48N6 missile series, which has a 250-kilometer range and can intercept incoming ballistic missiles across a radius of 60 kilometers. Reportedly, these missiles are capable of intercepting hypersonic projectiles up to a speed of Mach 8, flying at the edge of its range. Intercepts of targets flying at speeds over Mach 14 have also been reported. 2 additional missiles are supposedly under development for the S-400 launcher. The first is the 77N6. Unlike the other 2, this missile uses hit-to-kill technology equivalent to the Patriot's PAC-3. Such technology provides a particular advantage in a nuclear missile defense role, as the lack of a detonation would limit radioactive fallout. The 77N6 was in testing as of July 2021 and was supposed to enter service in 2022. The same missile was also meant to be available for Russia's newer S-500 system. However, both this missile and the S-500 appear to be behind schedule, perhaps unsurprisingly. The third missile supposedly in the S-400's arsenal is the 40N6. This projectile is supposed to bring the S-400's range up to 400 kilometers. In July 2023, it reportedly completed new tests. In November, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that it would be producing at least 1,000 of these missiles in 3 years, though sanctions make this production rate questionable. The experts at CSIS are also skeptical that the S-400's radar capacity will allow the 40N6 to operate at its purported range. The S-400 is one of the key pieces of military infrastructure for the heavily fortified Russian enclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic coastline. In addition to territorial defense, the Russian strategy for its deployment there has been to use it as an anti-access area denial system to disrupt the movement of NATO forces should a confrontation arise. The S-400 also saw service with Russian troops deployed in Syria, and it's a key aspect of Russia's strategy to defend Crimea. On February 25, 2022, the day after the invasion, the S-400 got its first confirmed combat kill when it shot down a Ukrainian Su-27 fighter jet operating around the country's capital of Kyiv. The kill of the plane, piloted by Colonel Alexander Oksenchenko, who was well known on the airshow circuit, was reportedly the longest-range downing of an aircraft on record. The S-400 continued to prove its worth in early March 2022, when it shot down 4 more Ukrainian Su-27s on the 5th of that month. Aside from its purported long-range and high-altitude defense, the S-400 is also capable of being used in offensive roles. In January 2023, Russia used the air defense system as part of a missile attack on Kyiv, with the staging point being Bryansk Oblast within Russian territory. Debris recovered after the attack by Ukrainian forces confirmed that the missile in question came from the S-400. So in the S-400, Russia has a formidable defensive and potentially offensive system, but just how good is it, really? Unfortunately for the S-400, the results in real-world, non-biased tests seem to indicate that it doesn't quite live up to the hype the Russians have built for it. At this point, we're not exactly surprised. Given Putin's track record of overhyping his weapons' capabilities in the past, perhaps skepticism was warranted all along. So what exactly falls short in the S-400's capabilities? Perhaps the best example came from the Turks. In December 2021, only a few years after it purchased the S-400 in the face of American sanctions, Ankara announced it would be going full throttle in developing a domestic air defense system to replace the Russian import. This is because Turkey actually accused Russia of fraud in the advertising of its S-400. These accusations came through the results of a series of tests in early 2020, where the S-400 was put up against drones and F-16 fighter jets. The Turks found that although their S-400 systems could indeed track targets up to 400 kilometers away, the said targets needed to be at an altitude of at least 20 kilometers for the air defense to work at the range it was advertised for. If the target drops below 5 kilometers, the efficiency drops enough to allow enemies to attack the S-400's position. The detection efficiency at such low altitudes, the Turks claim, drops between 30 and 40%. When the target drops to an altitude of 1 kilometer, the S-400's effective detection range goes down to a distance between 70 to 180 kilometers, depending on the terrain. Below 1 kilometer, the range drops enormously to only a few kilometers. In other words, the S-400's range is highly dependent on terrain, weather conditions, and the altitude of a target. The Turks say that low-altitude missiles and loitering munitions are therefore highly effective against the S-400. This sounds pleasing to the ears, but there is a problem with the assessment, and we will look into that in a bit. Right now, let's take a look at the S-400's supposedly greatest aspect and a key part of its hype for export, the inclusion of the Nebo-M radar system. Is it all it's cracked up to be? Here's how it works. This radar uses a pair of low-frequency arrays in the VHF and L bands. Supposedly, such low-frequency radar bands enhance the S-400's ability to detect stealth aircraft like the F-22 and F-35. These planes are specifically designed to be less detectable to high-frequency radar bands because these are the bands which enable missiles to hit their targets. In contrast, lower-frequency radar bands such as the VHF and L bands are better able to detect stealth aircraft from a long distance, and they are not designed to be stealthy against these frequencies in the same way. At first glance, the S-400 system is well equipped to handle this mission. A 2014 study done by Konstantinos Zakidis of the Hellenic Air Force seemed to reveal that the Nebo-M radar was capable of detecting the F-117 Nighthawk 250 kilometers away and could still detect it at a range of 72 kilometers even when under attack from enemy electronic warfare efforts such as jamming. This seemed to suggest that the S-400 would indeed be effective against stealth aircraft and capable of shooting them down. However, there are several problems with this item of hype. First, the F-117 was retired from active service in the late 2000s, so it was a poor choice to use as an example. Second, the F-22 and F-35 are far less detectable than the F-117, with radar cross-sections between 2 and 30 times smaller. Most importantly, being able to detect a stealth aircraft is not the same thing as being able to shoot it down. Detection with a low-band radar in the VHF and L bands will not by itself allow the S-400 to shoot down an incoming F-22 or F-35 because this is not sufficient for it to get a lock with one of its missiles. Only detection at higher frequencies can successfully guide a missile home. To get around this problem, the two low-frequency bands are designed to share their data with the third band in the S-400, the high-frequency Gamma S1 array, which broadcasts in the X and S bands. These can guide a missile to its target. In essence, the two low-frequency bands first track the incoming fighter, and then the high-frequency array is capable of using that data to shoot it down, or so the Russians say. In a contest between the S-400 and America's stealth aircraft, the outcome comes down to a simple question. Will the Russian air defense system be able to detect and shoot down the fighters before they can use their own weapons or call in a strike from somewhere else? Because of their smaller radar cross-sections, the F-22 and F-35 will be able to evade detection from the S-400 at much shorter ranges than the F-117. If the F-35's cross-section is, as reported, about the size of a golf ball, the Lightning II would only be detectable up to a range of about 20 miles, and that's at a low frequency. The USAF brass has admitted that the F-35 is stealthier than the F-22, but the Raptor would have a more or less similar level of protection. These two fighters would therefore almost certainly be in a position to destroy the S-400 with a long-range air-to-surface missile before they can be detected, much less threatened with a surface-to-air missile like the 48N6. For these reasons, shooting down the fifth-generation fighters is a much taller task for the S-400 to overcome than being able to casually shoot down the fourth-generation fighters that it did in the early days of the war in Ukraine. The problem becomes more pronounced when considering that the F-22 and F-35 have electronic warfare measures. Unlike the Su-27s it had demonstrated success against in February and March 2022, America's planes would be jamming the S-400. Ukraine's planes couldn't do this. But the S-400 has another problem that makes it less effective than it's hyped to be. At best, a full battalion would be able to launch 32 missiles in the sky. All air defense systems will be overwhelmed if the volume of incoming fire exceeds the system's capacity to respond. This is how Hamas overwhelmed Israel's vaunted Iron Dome in its October 2023 terrorist attack. The thousands of rockets that it launched into Israel, low-tech as they were simply too much for Iron Dome to overcome in such a short time. A typical Iron Dome battery consists of 3 or 4 launchers with a capacity of 20 missiles per launcher, making for a total between 60 and 80 missiles in the system. Its high capacity is one of the reasons it's proven so effective in countering projectiles that threaten Israeli population centers. The American-Norwegian NASAMS is another air defense system with a high payload capacity. A typical NASAMS-2 battery consists of 12 launchers, each of which has 6 missiles apiece, meaning that it can have 76 interceptors on standby. A Patriot battery, meanwhile, hosts 6 to 8 launching stations. Each launcher can carry 4 PAC-2 missiles or 16 PAC-3 missiles. As such, a typical Patriot battery has between 24 and 128 missiles, depending on how many launchers there are in the battery and whether the PAC-2 or the PAC-3 is the intended missile. So we see that the S-400 is lacking in interceptors compared to other air defense systems out there, including the Patriot, its closest American equivalent. The best way to overwhelm it would therefore be to launch a series of low-altitude cruise missiles or drones. We don't need to look at the Turks test in 2020 to bear this conclusion out. In April 2017, the United States launched a series of cruise missile strikes against targets in Syria in response to the Bashar al-Assad regime's use of chemical weapons in that country's civil war. The American cruise missiles specifically targeted the Shayrat Air Base near the city of Homs. There were S-400 systems in the area to defend the base. However, they failed to intercept the incoming American projectiles at a distance of 175 kilometers, far less than the purported 400-kilometer range that it has, and even less than the 48N6's effective range of 250 kilometers. Not a single American cruise missile was shot down in that operation. A year later, the United States again launched a cruise missile attack against targets in Syria with a similar level of success. The S-400 may also be vulnerable to much lower levels of technology than that seen in the United States' fifth-generation fighters. Recall that the S-400 bases at least 70% of its technology on the older S-300. The supposedly advanced NEBO-M radar system is the same as that used on the S-300, and the older air defense array has proven vulnerable against strikes from cruise missiles and drones like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2. In both Syria and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, the S-300 and its NEBO-M radar proved less effective against both of these arms. However, in an actual conflict between the United States and Russia, things would not be this simple. The S-400 is at its best when it's part of an integrated air defense network with other assets like AWACS planes. The Turks did not use its S-400 system in this way during their tests, so its less than perfect results for them might not have been surprising. The same goes with the Syrians in 2017. The presence of these planes will increase the efficiency of the S-400 significantly. All the same, Ukraine has proven quite good at detecting and shooting these planes down in early 2024. Russia has lost 2 of its 9 modernized operational A-50 AWACS planes to Ukrainian air defense missiles. In an air environment against an adversary like the United States, with even longer-range missiles and almost certain air superiority, if not air dominance, these planes would have a much harder time operating unimpeded, especially when the USAF can deploy the coming AIM-260 JATM in large numbers by the end of the decade. Russia would need to hide its A-50s at greater distances and behind fighters and air defense systems to defend them, making them less effective. In Ukraine, the S-300F air defense system proved incapable of stopping the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, from being sunk through a combination of drones to provide distraction and subsonic Neptune cruise missiles to deliver the killing blows. The poor weather that day again seemed to suggest that the S-300 and its successor, the S-400, had comparatively poor performance against targets flying at low altitudes, especially in less than optimal environmental conditions. The S-400 has had other problems in Ukraine. On August 23, 2023, an S-400 system defending Crimea mysteriously went up in flames near the village of Olenivka, on the peninsula's westernmost point. It was not clear what exactly caused the explosion, though experts suspected that a long-range air-launched Storm Shadow cruise missile provided by the British and French was responsible for the incident. It's also possible that the strike could have come from a Neptune or Harpoon anti-ship missile modified to hit targets on land, although this was less likely. Either way, even in the presence of a more integrated air defense network, the S-400 proved incapable of defeating a Ukrainian precision missile strike. According to the Oryx blog, Russia has lost one command post for an S-400, one 5P-85T2 launcher, 5 5P-85SM201 launchers, one 92N6A radar station for the S-400, and one support truck for the air defense system as of March 7, 2024. All of these have been destroyed. The destruction of the support truck in January 2024 seemed to confirm that Russia had deployed its S-400 system on internationally recognized Ukrainian territory for forward combat operations. Previously, the Russian armed forces had been known only to deploy the S-400 in Crimea within Russian territory and within the borders of Belarus to create a north-south area of coverage over the entire front in Ukraine. Despite its hype as a stealth-killing system, the S-400 likely isn't going to be taking out F-22s and F-35s anytime soon, even if it can detect their presence with its low-frequency radar. The United States' coming 6th-generation fighters, the Air Force's NGAD and Navy's F/A-XX, will almost certainly be even less observable than the 5th-generation fighters, making the S-400's task of defending the skies over Russian positions that much more difficult. The F-35's situational awareness adds another wrinkle to the S-400's prospects in a conflict, as its flying supercomputer attributes enable it to link with other assets in all branches of the United States Armed Forces to create what the brass at the Pentagon calls a kill web. This will be especially pronounced when the F-35 gets its Block 4 upgrades. So, for example, the F-35 might be able to spot an S-400 air defense system, and then, instead of attacking it itself and making it more vulnerable to being counterattacked, it can instead relay the data to a ship offshore that can then in turn send a barrage of cruise missiles against the Russian target, or command drones to attack it in order to cut down on costs. The coming 6th-generation fighters in America's air fleet will improve upon these abilities. All of this is not to say that Russia's S-400 is a poor quality system, but rather that the claims that it can destroy stealth aircraft just because its low-frequency radar might be able to detect them likely would not stand up to scrutiny in a real-world confrontation. Its comparatively low amount of available ammunition per battery would also be a problem in a full confrontation with the United States and NATO. The S-400 remains capable, but like usual, just not as capable as Russia claims. What do you think about Russia's S-400? Was it worth it for Turkey to acquire in the face of American sanctions?